This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I still can't bring myself to drive at night. 3 years later, and I still wake up in cold sweats when I hear static on the radio. My therapist says writing this down might help, so here goes. I've been driving trucks for almost 28 years. Montana to Washington was my regular route for Westland transport, medical supplies usually. Nothing exciting, just honest work that paid the bills and let me put my daughter Rebecca through college. I'd done that same Interstate 90 stretch hundreds of times, could practically drive it blindfolded. March 21st, 2020 was supposed to be just another routine haul. Left Billings around noon with a full load of PPE headed for Seattle. Masks, gloves, all that stuff everyone was scrambling for when COVID first hit. The roads were emptier than usual because of lockdowns starting up. Felt like I had the highway to myself most of the day. Everything was normal until about 9:30 that night. I was making good time, cruising through eastern Washington. Had my thermos of coffee, listening to some old Johnny Cash to keep me company. The sun had set a couple hours earlier, and there was this heavy fog starting to roll in. Not unusual for that time of year, but thicker than I'd seen in a while. That's when my radio started acting up. At first, it was just little bursts of static cutting through Johnny's voice. Annoying, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before in dead zones. I fiddled with the dial, tried to find a clearer signal. Then the music cut out completely, replaced by this weird humming tone. Low, almost below what you could hear, but you could feel it somehow. Made the hairs on my arms stand up. I switched stations. Nothing. Turned it off. The humming continued. Even tried the CB radio thinking maybe I could catch some chatter from other drivers, but that was even worse. Just this pulsing static that seemed to follow a pattern, almost like breathing. Then I heard the voice. It was distorted, slowed down, like someone talking through molasses. Couldn't make out words at first, just the cadence of speech. I'd been experiencing something similar for about 2 weeks on this route. Weird interference, voices breaking through even when the radio was off. That's why I'd started keeping a digital recorder in the cab. I clicked it on as soon as the voice started coming through clearer. Return, origin point, calibration required. The words didn't make sense, but they repeated in this loop that kept getting clearer. The voice sounded almost mechanical, but with human inflections, like those AI voices, but with something off about them. And the weirdest part was how it seemed to be addressing me directly. Samuel Corbin, verification, proceed to coordinates. How the hell did it know my name? I'm not ashamed to admit I was getting seriously freaked out by this point. Considered pulling over, but what good would that do in the middle of nowhere? Then my GPS screen flickered and went black before lighting up again with directions I hadn't entered. It was telling me to take exit 34, just a mile ahead. I'm not superstitious. Never believed in ghosts or aliens or any of that crap. But something about this felt wrong in my gut. I even said out loud, "This is crazy." But then the voice responded through the radio. Compliance necessary, signal degrading, limited window. I wish I could explain why I took that exit. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was because after almost 30 years of the same routes, the same sites, something inexplicable was happening. Or maybe, and this thought still scares me, whatever was broadcasting somehow influenced my decision-making. All I know is I found myself hitting the turn signal and taking exit 34 onto this narrow 2-lane road I'd never noticed before. The fog got thicker as soon as I left the interstate. My headlights barely cut through it, creating this tunnel effect where I could only see about 20 feet ahead. The road started winding through dense forest, tall pines and cedars looming on either side. My truck's engine strained slightly as the road began to climb. The dashboard instruments started going haywire about 7 miles in. The temperature gauge dropped rapidly, showing outside temps plummeting to 0, then -20, then -40. impossible for Washington in March. The clock started glitching too, jumping between 10:16 and 10:18 repeatedly. My speedometer would jump from 45 to 90 and back, even though I could feel I wasn't changing speed. I noted all this in my logbook. Unusual broadcast coming through radio. Will investigate frequency source. Professional to the end, I guess. Ridiculous in retrospect. The road widened slightly at a bend, with enough shoulder to safely pull over. I decided enough was enough. I needed to get my bearings and figure out what the hell was happening. I hit the hazards, properly parked, but left the engine running. Grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, took a swig of coffee from my thermos, and checked my watch. 10:15 p.m. That's when things got truly bizarre. As I sat there, the humming from the radio intensified, and through my windshield, I noticed something in the forest ahead. A faint bluish glow pulsing between the trees, maybe a quarter-mile away. It wasn't like headlights or a house light. It had this quality that's hard to describe, like it wasn't reflecting light but somehow bending it. The voice came through again, clearer than ever. Samuel Corbin, calibration complete, approach the beacon. I remember saying out loud, "What beacon?" And the radio immediately responded, "You can see it now. Approach on foot. Vehicle interference unacceptable." I got out of the cab, locked it, force of habit even then, and stood there for a moment, flashlight in hand. The forest was dead silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just that humming, now seeming to come from the direction of the blue light. I clicked on my recorder again and spoke into it. "I can see it now through the trees, the source of the broadcast. This isn't possible." The blue light pulsed brighter, almost beckoning. Against every survival instinct, I started walking toward it. The ground was soft from recent rain, my boots leaving clear prints in the mud. The air felt strange, heavy, like the pressure before a storm, but also charged somehow. My flashlight beam started flickering about 20 feet from the truck, then went out completely, but I could still see perfectly by that blue glow. As I got closer, the humming organized itself into a pattern that almost sounded like words, but in no language I recognized. The blue light seemed to be emanating from the base of an enormous cedar tree, bigger than any I'd seen in these forests before. The light wasn't coming from anything I could identify. No lantern, no electronic device. It seemed to be coming from the air itself, concentrated around the massive trunk. The tree looked wrong. Its bark pattern shifted slightly when you weren't looking directly at it. And I swear there were angles to it that didn't make sense, parts that seemed farther away than they should be, given where I was standing. About 30 feet from my truck, standing before this tree, the humming stopped abruptly. Complete silence fell. Then a voice, not from my radio this time, but seemingly from the air around me, spoke clearly. Calibration complete. Temporal variance accepted. Extraction proceeding. The blue light intensified, forming what looked like a vertical column that extended upward through the branches of the cedar. It wasn't smoke or mist. It moved against the slight breeze, perfectly straight up into the night sky. I felt a tingling sensation across my skin, like static electricity but deeper, reaching into my muscles, my bones. I turned to run back to my truck, but my body wouldn't respond properly. Each step felt like moving through thick syrup. The blue light began to wrap around me in tendrils, and the humming returned, louder inside my head now. What happened next is harder to describe coherently. The forest around me seemed to fold, like reality was a piece of paper being manipulated by unseen hands. The cedar tree expanded, or maybe I contracted, and suddenly I was looking at structures within its bark that couldn't possibly exist. Geometric patterns that shifted in 3 dimensions, forming and reforming into what looked like writing or circuit diagrams. My digital recorder floated out of my pocket, suspended in the air before me. The blue light enveloped it, and it shot upward, disappearing into the branches. Then came a sensation of being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. Not painfully, but with irresistible force. The ground beneath me became transparent, and I could see down through layers of earth, rock, and what looked like flowing currents of light beneath it all. The sky above split open, revealing not stars but what I can only describe as pathways, tunnels of light extending in impossible directions. The voice spoke one last time. Subject secured. Return to point of origin initiated. Then everything. The forest, the blue light, the cedar tree, Washington State, the entire world as I knew it, collapsed into a single point of blinding white. And I was somewhere else entirely. I can't describe where I was after that. It wasn't a place in any sense we understand. There was no up or down, no light or dark, just information, endless streams of it flowing around and through me. I wasn't experiencing it with my senses. I was the information, temporarily. I don't know how long I existed in that state. Time had no meaning there. But eventually, I found myself back in a physical form, lying on my back in an unfamiliar forest at dawn. Not the same forest from Washington. The trees were different. The air smelled different. My clothes were the same, but my digital recorder was gone. I've spent 3 years trying to find my way back home. I've learned I'm not in the same version of Earth I left behind. Things here are subtly different. History took slightly different turns. Technology developed along different paths. There are people here with my daughter's name, my wife's name, but they're not my family. I've tried telling my story, but people here just think I'm mentally ill. Maybe I am. Maybe this is all an elaborate delusion. But I know what I experienced. Sometimes at night I still try scanning radio frequencies, hoping to hear that humming again. I've mapped the stars, trying to find differences that might help me understand where I am relative to my home. I've returned to Washington State, tried to find that exact spot on that forest road, but the exit doesn't exist here, not with the same number anyway. All I know is that whatever happened that night, whatever calibration that voice was performing, it tore me from my reality and placed me in this one. And somewhere, in some other Washington, my truck is probably still sitting on that forest road, engine running, hazard lights blinking, with no explanation for where Samuel Corbin disappeared to on March 21st, 2020. I just want to go home. Story 2. I still can't shake what happened to me last winter. I live in this small town right on the border in a semi-desert area. It's one of those places where everyone kind of knows each other, but we're all spread out enough that you can feel completely alone sometimes. Our house sits on this steep hill, and I have to walk down to catch the school bus every morning. During winter, I'd leave while it was still completely dark outside, like pitch black except for the moonlight and this one sad street light at the bottom of the hill. I'm 17, and I've made this walk 1,000,000 times, so I wasn't usually scared. Our neighborhood is just this little cul-de-sac with only 3 other houses besides ours, and most mornings I wouldn't see a single person on my way down. The landscape around our road is all dry shrubs, some cacti, and not much else. When you walk alone that early, all you hear is your own footsteps on the gravel, sometimes bats flapping around that streetlight, and coyotes howling way off in the distance. It's usually dead quiet otherwise. I first noticed the white van about a month ago. It was just sitting there near my bus stop, engine running. I didn't think much of it that first day. We get delivery vans and work trucks passing through sometimes. But then I noticed it again the next day, and the day after that. What really started to freak me out was how it only showed up when I was alone at the stop. If other kids from the houses down the road were there waiting with me, no van. But on the days when it was just me, there it was, idling maybe 20 feet away. The driver was this older guy, probably around 70, white hair, these thick glasses. At first, he just sat there watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, but I tried to ignore it. I'd just stare at my phone or look down the road for the bus. After about a week of this, he started opening his window. The first time he just asked, "Cold morning, isn't it?" I just nodded and looked away. What else was I supposed to do? I was alone on this road with barely any houses around. A few days later, he said, "You look cold standing there. You sure you don't want to wait in here where it's warm?" I pretended I didn't hear him. My stomach was in knots the whole time. I texted my friend to stay on the phone with me until the bus came. By the 3rd week, his comments got way worse. "You're cold, but you look beautiful today." I remember feeling like I was going to throw up. I kept my eyes on the road, praying for the bus to hurry up. I started wearing baggier clothes, hoping he wouldn't notice me as much, but it didn't matter. Last Monday was when things got really scary. I was standing there like always, and the van pulled up closer than usual. He rolled down his window all the way this time. I could smell cigarettes and something else I couldn't identify coming from inside the van. "A pretty girl like you must be freezing," he said, smiling in this way that made my skin crawl. "Get in the van with me, I'll keep you warm until the bus comes." The way he said it, I felt like my feet were cemented to the ground. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. All I could think was that there was nobody around to help me if he got out of that van. Just as I was trying to decide whether to run back up the hill to my house, the school bus appeared around the corner. The van immediately drove off. I got on the bus, shaking so bad, my friend asked if I was sick. I couldn't even talk about it at school that day. I just kept thinking about what would have happened if the bus had been late. That night, I finally broke down and told my dad. I probably should have told him sooner, but I didn't want to worry him or make him think I couldn't handle myself. My dad works in security, and I've never seen him look so angry. He started asking me all these questions: what the van looked like, what the guy looked like, how often he showed up. When I told him about the invitation to get in the van, he immediately called the police. The officer who came to our house told us they'd had similar reports from other parts of town, an older man in a white van approaching young women. They took my statement and said they'd have officers in the area the next morning. I barely slept that night. I kept imagining the van parked outside our house, the man somehow knowing I'd reported him. Dad offered to drive me to school, but the police wanted to try to catch this guy. They said the best way was to keep my routine normal, but have officers nearby. The next morning was the scariest walk of my life. Even though I knew police were hidden somewhere watching, I felt completely exposed. My hands were sweating despite the cold, and I kept looking back up the hill, measuring how fast I could run home if I needed to. Sure enough, right on schedule, the white van appeared. It drove slowly down our road and stopped right where it always did. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The windows started to roll down, and I could see his face again with those thick glasses and that same smile. Before he could say anything, two unmarked police cars suddenly appeared. One from behind a large shrub area where they must have been waiting, and another from down the road. They boxed in the van, and officers jumped out with their hands on their weapons. It happened so fast, they pulled him out of the van and had him in handcuffs within seconds. I stood there frozen, watching the whole thing. One female officer came over and led me away, asking if I was okay. I couldn't even answer her. That afternoon, my dad came home early from work. He sat me down and told me what the police had found in the van: duct tape, plastic bags, zip ties, condoms and lubricant, black garbage bags, a machete, and other things he wouldn't even tell me about. The man had claimed to be delivering newspapers, but there weren't any newspapers in the van. When they ran his information, they found out he had a criminal record from another state. Dad didn't give me all the details, but from the look on his face, I knew it was bad. I never found out exactly what happened to him legally. My parents tried to shield me from most of it, and honestly, I didn't want to know. All that mattered was that he never came back to our street. It's been 4 months now. I still take the same bus, still walk down the same hill, but everything feels different. Sometimes I think about how close I came that day. If he had gotten out of the van before I told anyone, if the bus had been late, if I had given in to the fear of bothering my parents with my problems. The thing that haunts me most is how ordinary everything seemed that morning. Just another cold day, just another walk to the bus. How many times had I stood at that exact spot, completely vulnerable, before I even noticed him watching me? Had he been there before, and I just hadn't seen him? Every time I stand alone at the end of that road now, I can't help thinking that if he had gotten out of that van that day, I might have had no way to defend myself. In a place this empty, with houses so far apart, no one would have heard anything, and maybe no one would have ever heard from me again. The police told my parents that predators like him count on people staying quiet, on feeling embarrassed or thinking they're overreacting. They said I did the right thing by speaking up when I did. But sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, thinking about all the mornings I stood there alone before I told anyone, how close I might have come to disappearing without a trace. And I wonder about the other girls in those similar reports the police mentioned. Did they all speak up in time too? I'll never look at a white van the same way again, and I'll never ignore that feeling in my gut that tells me something isn't right. That feeling saved my life. Story 3. I still can't sleep when the snow gets heavy. Every winter storm takes me right back to that day in '92. I've been with the Iowa State Patrol for 28 years now, but nothing in my career has stuck with me like January 17th, 1992. It was the kind of blizzard they write about in history books. Temperatures hovering around 15 below zero, wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour, and snow coming down so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. I was 34 then, had been a trooper for just over 6 years. Young enough to think I'd seen it all, old enough to know better. That morning, my sergeant had called and told me to stay home. Most of the highways were closed anyway, but I lived just off I-35, and something about sitting at home while people might be stranded out there didn't sit right with me. So I suited up, extra thermal layers, heaviest gloves, the works. Called in to dispatch that I was taking my cruiser out to check for stranded motorists near the Mason City Junction. My wife, Sarah, begged me not to go. We had a 4-year-old daughter then. Sarah kept saying, "Rob, you've got nothing to prove." I kissed her goodbye and told her I'd be careful. I remember her exact words as I left. "Some people can't be saved, Rob. Don't become one of them." The roads were apocalyptic. My cruiser had chains on the tires, but even with that, I was crawling at maybe 15 miles per hour. Visibility was virtually zero, just white everywhere. The wind was howling so loud it sometimes drowned out my radio. I'd been out for about 2 hours, helped a family in a minivan who'd slid into a ditch, when I spotted something odd about a quarter mile ahead. Just a dark shape on the shoulder of the highway. Could have been anything, a boulder, debris from a truck, anything. But something about it made me slow down. As I got closer, I realized it was a car, a dark sedan, almost completely covered in snow. Just the back corner of the trunk was visible. I pulled up behind it, put on my flashers, though I don't know who would have seen them in that weather. I remember thinking it was probably abandoned. People do that in blizzards, ditch their cars and get picked up, planning to retrieve them when the weather clears. Getting out of my cruiser was like stepping into a freezer with a fan. The cold hit me like a physical blow. I trudged through snow up to my knees to reach the sedan. It was a Buick, newer model. No signs of movement inside. I knocked on the driver's window, brushing away snow with my gloved hand. Nothing. I tried the door, locked. I circled around, checking all the doors, all locked. No signs of forced entry or accident damage. Just a car parked neatly on the shoulder, almost completely buried in snow. But something felt wrong. The snow pattern wasn't right. Most of the car was covered in a smooth blanket of white, but the trunk had these odd patterns, like someone had been opening and closing it recently. I radioed in the license plate and waited for dispatch to run it. While waiting, I cleared more snow from the windows, peering inside with my flashlight. The car was empty, but the interior was pristine. No signs of struggle, no personal items strewn about. It looked prepared. That's the only word I can think of, like someone had cleaned it. Dispatch came back. The car belonged to a Richard Meyer, 42, from Des Moines, pharmaceutical sales rep. No criminal record, no outstanding warrants, nothing unusual. I decided to check the trunk. I don't know why. Just instinct, I guess. 28 years on the job, you develop a sense for when something's not right. I tried the trunk release inside the car, but it was locked. I went back to the trunk itself, examined it more closely. There were scratch marks around the lock, subtle but definitely there. I radioed dispatch again, requested permission to force entry due to suspicious circumstances. They gave me the go-ahead. I took the crowbar from my cruiser and popped the trunk. I'll never forget what I saw when that trunk opened. Never. The body was frozen solid. A man in a suit, tie still perfectly knotted, positioned like he was sleeping, except for his face. His face told the whole story. The terror in his eyes, frozen open, the bruising around his neck, the small, precise cuts on his cheeks, methodical and deliberate. The worst part wasn't the body, though. It was how arranged everything was. His briefcase was positioned next to him, closed and latched. His shoes were polished. His hair was combed. Someone had taken great care with him after death, like preparing a display. I've seen dead bodies before. Car accidents, suicides, bar fights gone wrong. But this was different. This was calculated. This was a message. I radioed in a code 32, homicide, and requested backup and forensics. Dispatch told me the nearest available units were at least 2 hours out due to road conditions. I was on my own. For the next 3 hours, I sat in my cruiser with the engine running, keeping watch over that Buick in the snowstorm. Occasionally, I'd get out to clear snow from my tailpipe or check that nothing had changed with the scene. The whole time, I kept thinking about the victim, about Richard Meyer. Was he alive when the storm started? Did he know what was coming? Did he have family waiting for him somewhere? By the time backup arrived, 2 county deputies and a state forensics tech who'd managed to make it through the storm, I was nearly hypothermic despite the heater. We secured the scene as best we could. The tech took preliminary photos, but a full processing would have to wait until the weather cleared. I didn't know it then, but Richard Meyer was just the beginning. 3 weeks later, February 8th, we found the second victim. Another blizzard, even worse than the first. A county deputy discovered an abandoned Chevy Impala near Iowa Falls. Same scenario. Professional man, tortured, strangled, redressed, and left in the trunk of his own car during a winter storm. Then a third on February 23rd, this time near the Minnesota border. The pattern was undeniable now. The FBI established a task force they called Snowman. I was assigned as the Iowa State Patrol liaison. We worked around the clock, interviewing families, checking highway cameras, though most were useless during the storms, creating victim profiles. The victims had nothing in common, except they were all professional men traveling alone during storms. All had been tortured methodically for what the medical examiner estimated was days, not hours. All had been strangled. All had been carefully redressed and arranged. The breakthrough came from a Minneapolis detective named Michael Harrington. He'd been working cold cases from the 80s and noticed similarities with 3 unsolved murders from Minnesota. Professional men, signs of torture found during winter storms. The cases had been spread over 5 years, so no one had connected them before. Harrington had a theory about a suspect. Nathan Blackwood, former Minneapolis PD, forced to resign 6 years earlier after excessive force complaints. After losing his badge, Blackwood had bounced around the Midwest doing security work. His last known address was a cabin near Clear Lake, Iowa, less than 20 miles from where I found Richard Meyer. We put together a surveillance team, but Blackwood was smart. He lived off the grid, no credit cards, no cell phone. We couldn't find him. Until March 7th, when a Wisconsin state trooper pulled over a pickup for a broken taillight. Routine stop. The driver handed over his license, Nathan Blackwood. The trooper had been briefed on the Snowman case. He called for backup while pretending to run the license. When Blackwood realized what was happening, he tried to flee, but they caught him. In his truck, they found a counterfeit Iowa State Patrol uniform, a police scanner, and detailed weather forecasts for the next week. In his wallet was a photo of Richard Meyer, taken while he was still alive, tied to a chair in what looked like a basement. The FBI searched Blackwood's cabin and a storage unit he rented in Cedar Rapids. They found journals, dozens of them, detailing everything. He monitored weather forecasts, positioned himself along highways where he knew businessmen would be traveling. He wore that fake uniform to approach stranded motorists, offering help during storms. Once he had them isolated, he'd take them to abandoned properties he'd scouted in advance. The journals described what he did to them over those days. I can't repeat it. I've tried to forget those details, but they're burned into my brain. What haunts me most is what he wrote about leaving the bodies. I place them in caskets of their own making. I return their dignity in death that I took from them in life. I leave them where they will be found by those who, like me, once wore the badge. During interrogation, Blackwood finally explained why. He said that as a patrol officer, he'd found too many people he couldn't save. Accident victims, suicide jumpers, frozen homeless. It broke something in him. He said, "I wanted other cops to feel that same helplessness, to know what it's like to find someone you can't possibly help." Blackwood was sentenced to life without parole. He's in a maximum security prison in Illinois now. I testified at his trial, described finding Richard Meyer. I looked Blackwood in the eyes as I testified. He smiled at me. The Snowman case changed everything for highway patrol operations during winter storms. We implemented verification codes for all officers approaching stranded motorists. We developed specific training for extreme weather operations. We tried to make sure nothing like this could happen again. But for me, for many of us who worked the case, the scars never really healed. I still carry a photo of Richard Meyer in my wallet. Not the crime scene photo, a family photo his wife gave me at the trial. Him smiling with his 2 daughters at a backyard barbecue. I look at it sometimes when I'm on patrol during snowstorms, to remind myself why I do this job. I've never told this story in full before. Even now, 30 years later, I can feel the cold seeping into my bones when I think about that day. The Snowman case taught me that the most dangerous predators aren't always obvious monsters. Sometimes they wear familiar faces, exploit our trust, hide behind symbols of safety. Every winter when the snow starts falling, I think about Richard Meyer in that trunk. I think about Nathan Blackwood watching the weather forecast, planning his hunt. And I wonder how many other predators are out there waiting for the right storm. Story 4. I still can't sleep without checking the locks 3 times. It's been 4 months since that night at the radio station, and I'm writing this down because my therapist thinks it might help. I don't know if it will, but I need to tell someone who might actually believe me. I'd been working the midnight shift at WPIN Radio in Pinewood for almost a year. It's a small station in an even smaller town where nothing ever happens. The job was perfect for me. I could play whatever music I wanted, talk about whatever crossed my mind, and nobody really cared. The station manager barely listened to my show, and I doubt many people in town stayed up that late. But that was fine. I liked the solitude. The station itself is this old brick building from the 70s tucked away on the edge of town. During the day there's a full staff, producers, other hosts, ad people. But at night, it was just me, the whole place to myself. I'd gotten used to the creaks of the building, the way the heating system would kick on with a groan around 2 a.m., the flickering fluorescent light in the hallway that nobody ever fixed. That night in December started like any other. It was pouring rain, the kind that sounds like someone's throwing gravel at the windows. The wind was brutal too, cutting right through my jacket as I hurried from my car to the station entrance. I remember checking my watch as I unlocked the door, 11 p.m. exactly. I had an hour to set up before going live. I'd stopped at the gas station for energy drinks on the way. I always needed at least 2 to make it through till morning. The caffeine jitters were better than falling asleep mid-sentence, on air, which I'd done once and got a warning from my boss. Walking into that empty building always felt eerie, but I'd gotten used to it. I flipped on lights as I went, my footsteps echoing down the hallway. The studio was at the back, a small room with soundproofed walls, a desk with the broadcasting equipment, and a single window that looked out into darkness. I remember setting down my bag, cracking open an energy drink, and starting my usual routine. At exactly midnight, I went live. Good evening, Night Owls. This is Mateus Cardoso coming to you live from the darkest corner of Pinewood. It's 32 degrees outside with enough rain to build an ark, so if you're still awake, congratulations on making terrible life choices like me. We've got some indie tracks coming up, but first, let me tell you about this crazy story I read today. I rambled about some guy who tried to steal a reindeer from the Christmas market 2 towns over. The police report said he claimed he was test driving it for Santa. I was mid-laugh about it when the phone line lit up. That's the thing, calls were rare on my show. Maybe 1 or 2 a night, usually wrong numbers or drunk people. So when that light blinked, I felt a little surge of excitement. Someone was actually listening. I pressed the button to put them on air. "Good evening. You're on with Mateus," I said, trying to sound professional instead of desperate for human interaction. Nothing but static came through. Not the normal kind, but a weird, fluctuating hiss that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Hello? Hello? Anyone there?" I tried again, thinking maybe they had a bad connection. The static crackled, then the line went dead. I shrugged it off and went back to my playlist. Just a wrong number or bad reception from the storm. About 20 minutes later, I was queuing up another song when the phone lit up again. Something felt off this time. I hesitated before answering, my finger hovering over the button. I told myself I was being stupid. It was just a phone call. "You're live on WPIN," I said, trying to sound upbeat. That static again, but different. It pulsed, almost like it had a rhythm, and underneath it, I swear I heard something else. A whisper, so faint I couldn't make out any words, just the sense that someone was trying to speak. "Hello, if you're trying to call us, maybe you need to adjust your phone or speak up," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded fake even to me. The whisper grew louder for a second, but still unintelligible, like someone was talking with their mouth pressed against the microphone. Then the call dropped. I felt uneasy, but played it off on air, making a joke about ghosts trying to request songs. I cranked up the volume on the next track, trying to drown out the silence of the building around me. At 1:15 a.m., the phone rang again. By now, the station felt unnaturally quiet. The rain had eased up, and even the wind had died down. Just me and the soft glow of the equipment. "All right," I said, picking up. "You've got me now. What's up?" The static was there, but fainter this time. Then I heard it. Clear as day, a voice whispered my name. "Mateus." My blood ran cold. Not because they knew my name, I announced it on air constantly, but because of how they said it. Like they knew me personally, like they were standing right behind me. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice coming out harder than I intended. The whisper came again, slower this time. "Mateus, you dropped your pen." I froze completely. My whole body went rigid. Because about 10 minutes earlier, I'd been scribbling notes for a segment, and my pen had rolled off the desk. It was still on the floor where I'd left it. There was no way anyone could know that. The studio has no windows except for small ones near the ceiling that are covered with blackout curtains. The door was closed. I was completely alone in a locked building. I slammed the receiver down, my hands shaking. I looked around wildly, scanning for cameras, for some explanation of how someone could know what I'd just done. Nothing. Just the same studio I'd worked in hundreds of times before. For the next hour, I couldn't focus. I kept stumbling over words, playing the wrong tracks, messing up station IDs. My eyes constantly darted around the room, looking for anything unusual. I kept the music going as much as possible so I wouldn't have to talk. The phone didn't ring again until 2:10 a.m. I stared at the blinking light, my stomach in knots. I let it ring 4 times before I finally answered. "Hello?" I said quietly, not bothering with the usual radio greeting. The static was softer now, almost like a whisper itself. Then the voice spoke again. "Look outside." I should have ignored it. Should have hung up and called the police right then. But some stupid part of me had to know. I told listeners I was taking a short break, queued up a longer song, and grabbed the flashlight I kept in my desk drawer. The hallway seemed longer and darker than usual as I made my way to the lobby. The front doors were glass, but the rain had fogged them up, making it hard to see anything clearly. I stood there for a moment, flashlight in hand, wondering if I was completely losing it. Slowly, I raised the light and pointed it toward the doors. At first, all I saw was my own distorted reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. Then I saw it, or rather, them. Beyond the glass, standing completely still in the rain, was a figure in a dark hood. Their face was completely obscured by shadow, but I could see they were holding something up to their ear, a phone. They didn't move, didn't react to my flashlight, just stood there, rain streaming down their jacket, phone pressed to their ear. Then, as if sensing I was watching, they slowly tilted their head up. I couldn't see their face, but somehow I knew they were looking directly at me. And then the lobby phone rang. I don't remember running back to the studio. I just remember slamming the door shut and locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. I called my station manager first, leaving a desperate voicemail about someone outside the building. Then I called the police. Those 15 minutes waiting for them to arrive were the longest of my life. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, huddled under the desk, listening for any sound of someone trying to get in. The whole time, the on-air phone kept ringing. I never answered it again. When the police finally arrived, they found nothing. No one outside, no footprints, the rain had washed them away, no signs of anyone trying to break in. They looked at me like I was crazy or on drugs. One officer even asked if I'd fallen asleep and had a nightmare, but then they checked the security footage. The station has cameras covering the parking lot and entrance. The footage showed exactly what I'd described. A figure in a dark hood standing outside the station for nearly an hour, pacing back and forth before finally stopping at the door. They were on the phone the entire time. When the officers reviewed the footage more closely, they noticed something that made my blood freeze. At exactly 1:15 a.m., when the caller had mentioned my dropped pen, the figure had looked directly at the camera and smiled. Just a flash of teeth in the darkness under that hood. The police increased patrols around the station for a few weeks. They never identified the person. The phone company couldn't trace the calls. They seemed to come from nowhere, from a number that didn't exist. I took a week off after that, claiming I had the flu. When I came back, I requested a transfer to the day shift. I never worked the overnight show again. 4 months later, and I still jump when my phone rings. I've moved to an apartment with better security. I keep the blinds closed at night. I check the backseat of my car before getting in, because whoever that caller was, they wanted me to know something important. I was never as alone as I thought I was. Someone was always watching. And sometimes when I'm in the studio during daylight hours surrounded by other staff members, I still feel eyes on me. I still hear that whisper in my head. Mateus. The worst part. Last week I dropped my pen during a broadcast, and my phone rang immediately after. I didn't answer it. I won't ever answer it again. Story 5. I never wanted to go back to Idaho, not after what happened in Stillwater, but since so many people have been sharing stories about unusual encounters in the Pacific Northwest lately, I feel obligated to warn others. What I experienced there wasn't a ghost or a cryptid or whatever else people keep posting about. It was something much worse because it was deliberate. I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in migration patterns. 2 years ago, I was tracking some seriously abnormal animal behavior in northern Idaho. Multiple species, deer, coyotes, foxes, even bears, were all converging on the same location every November. This isn't normal. Different species don't coordinate their movements like that. I'd been collecting data for months, tagging animals and tracking their paths, trying to understand what could possibly draw such diverse wildlife to one specific area. The day everything went to hell started normally enough. I was following my GPS coordinates in my Subaru, driving deep into a valley that wasn't on any of my maps. The roads were getting narrower, barely maintained. My department-issued vehicle was struggling with the terrain, but I was determined to reach the convergence point. The snow had started falling earlier that morning, but I wasn't worried. I had emergency supplies and my satellite phone. The snowfall got heavier as I drove deeper into the valley. The forest was dense on either side, tall pines closing in. I remember thinking it was strangely quiet. No birds, no sounds of small animals, just the crunch of snow under my tires and the increasingly concerning rattle from my engine. When I rounded a bend and saw houses in the distance, I was relieved. The settlement wasn't on any of my maps, but that's not unheard of in remote areas. I figured I could ask for directions, maybe get some local insight about the wildlife. As I got closer, I realized this wasn't just a few cabins, it was an entire town. Wooden buildings lined a main street with homes scattered up the hillsides. A weathered sign at the edge of town read, "Stillwater, Est 1891. My car chose that moment to give up, sputtering to a stop just as I reached the town limits. Great timing. The snow was really coming down now, visibility dropping by the minute. I grabbed my backpack with my notebooks and equipment, pulled on my heavy coat, and headed toward what looked like a general store. Inside, the store was warm but dimly lit. The shelves were stocked with basics, canned goods, dried foods, practical supplies, but nothing branded or packaged like you'd see in a normal store. Everything looked locally made. The man behind the counter looked up as I entered, and I still remember how his eyes widened slightly. He was older, maybe in his 70s, but he stood straight and moved with an energy that seemed out of place for his age. "You're not from around here," he said. Not a question. I explained my situation, my research, my broken-down car, the unexpected snowstorm, asked if there was a mechanic in town who could help me get back on the road. He introduced himself as Bennett Larson and told me there was no mechanic, at least not one who could help today. The storm was setting in, and I'd likely be stuck until tomorrow at the earliest. "We don't get many visitors in Stillwater," he said, his voice oddly tense, "especially not this time of year." He made a call on an old rotary phone, the first sign that this place was different. No cell service, no modern tech. The person on the other end seemed to argue with him, but eventually Bennett hung up and told me he had permission to let me stay in his guest cabin until the storm passed. As we walked through town to his place, I noticed things that didn't quite add up. For a town of its size, maybe a couple thousand people from what I could see, Stillwater had a strange demographic. Everyone I saw appeared either middle-aged or elderly, but they all moved with unusual vigor. No teenagers hanging around, no young children playing in the snow. And everyone stared at me as we passed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and what I now recognize as alarm. Bennett's property sat at the edge of town, a main house and a small cabin about 50 yards away. He showed me to the cabin, got the wood stove going, and told me in no uncertain terms to stay inside until morning. "Town's having a community meeting tonight about the winter preparations. Outsiders aren't welcome. I'll bring you some dinner later." The cabin was basic but comfortable. A bed, a table, a couple of chairs, and a small bathroom. The windows faced the town, and as the afternoon waned, I noticed more activity on the streets. People were heading in the same direction, toward a large building in the center of town that looked like a community hall. But what made me first realize something was very wrong was when I saw the animals. From my window, I had a clear view of the forest edge. As dusk fell, deer emerged from the trees, not running or grazing, but walking purposefully in a straight line toward town. Behind them came foxes, moving just as deliberately. And then, I still get chills thinking about it, a full-grown black bear lumbered out of the forest, following the same path. The animals moved through town alongside the residents, all heading toward that central building. No one seemed alarmed by the wildlife walking among them. In fact, some people seemed to acknowledge the animals, almost like neighbors passing on the street. I knew immediately this was connected to the migration patterns I'd been tracking. I had to get closer, see what was happening in that building. I waited until Bennett brought me a bowl of stew, which I pretended to eat while he watched. After he left, I poured it down the sink. Something felt off about it, a strange smell underneath the savory aroma. I waited another hour, then slipped out of the cabin. The snow had stopped, and the night was clear and cold, the moon casting blue shadows across the white ground. I stuck to those shadows, moving toward the community hall. The streets were empty now. Everyone was inside. The building had windows high up on the walls, too high for me to see through directly. I found a storage shed nearby and managed to climb on top, giving me a partial view inside. What I saw through those windows has haunted me every night since. The interior was enormous, much larger than it appeared from outside, as if it extended underground. The floor wasn't wood or concrete, but covered in something that looked like moss or lichen, glowing faintly with bioluminescence. The walls were lined with translucent, membrane-like structures that pulsed with fluid, almost like enormous veins or arteries built into the architecture. The people of Stillwater stood in concentric circles around a central point I couldn't quite see. Among them were the animals, deer, foxes, the bear, and others I hadn't seen arrive. They stood calmly among the humans as if this was perfectly normal. But what terrified me most were the connections, thin, fibrous tendrils extending from the walls and floor, attached to both humans and animals like IVs or feeding tubes, inserted into arms, necks, flanks. Some of the people were changing as I watched, their fingers elongated unnaturally. Patches of what looked like fur sprouted on exposed skin. Their postures shifted, becoming less human. And the animals, God, the animals were changing too, their limbs and features becoming more anthropomorphic. I was so transfixed by the horror below that I didn't hear anyone approach until a hand clamped over my mouth. I was dragged down from my perch and came face to face with a woman in her 60s with silver hair and unnaturally bright eyes. "Dr. Chen," she said, knowing my name, though I'd never told it to Bennett or anyone else. "I'm Mayor Diana Huxley. You weren't supposed to see this yet. We would have properly prepared you." They took me inside through a side entrance. I fought, but there were too many of them, their grips inhumanly strong. The main chamber was even more horrifying up close. The air smelled like a mixture of hospital antiseptic and wet earth. The floor squished beneath my feet, the moss-like growth reacting to my steps, reaching upward slightly as if trying to touch me. At the center of the room stood an enormous tank filled with luminescent fluid. Suspended within were hundreds of smaller, brain-like organs, some recognizably human, others clearly animal, and many representing impossible hybrid forms. They pulsed in unison, connected by the same fibrous material that extended throughout the building. Stillwater was founded on a vision, Mayor Huxley explained as they forced me toward an empty space in one of the circles. Our founders discovered something extraordinary in a meteorite impact site, a neural symbiote capable of accelerating evolution through controlled hybridization. For generations, we've been combining human and animal genetics to create a new form of consciousness, a bridge between species. She spoke with reverence, as if describing a religious experience rather than the abomination before me. Each November, we strengthen the collective, integrate new genetic material. The animals come willingly. They're part of us now. And you, Dr. Chen, with your understanding of migration and population dynamics, you're exactly what the collective needs. I noticed now that everyone in the room had some subtle abnormality. Elongated fingers, unusual eye coloration, patches of textured skin that wasn't quite human. No one under 16, no one over 80. I realized with horror that children must be kept away until they were old enough to integrate, and the elderly. The elderly probably couldn't survive the transformation anymore. As they prepared to connect me to this biological nightmare, I remembered something from my research, the specific frequencies that disrupt migration patterns, the bat vocalization recordings on my phone that I'd been using to test responses in other mammals. It was a desperate move, but I managed to reach my pocket, activate the recording at maximum volume. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The neural tank pulsed erratically. The tendrils connecting everyone convulsed. People and animals alike began screaming, a unified, multi-species howl of pain that I'll never forget. In the chaos, I broke free and ran. I spent that night and the next day hiding in the forest, slowly making my way out of the valley in the bitter cold. Eventually, I reached a logging road where a truck driver found me, hypothermic and babbling about animals walking like people. He thought I was delirious. When federal agents responded to my report days later, they found Stillwater largely abandoned. There was evidence of advanced biotechnology in the community hall, but most of it had been destroyed or removed. They found partial remains of transformed individuals who hadn't survived whatever evacuation had occurred. I led them to the neural tank, but it was empty, drained of its contents. I was debriefed, examined, and eventually released with a gag order and a psychological evaluation that labeled me as suffering from exposure-induced delusions. But I know what I saw, and I know something worse. They're still out there. The monitoring stations I've set up independently have documented wildlife exhibiting unprecedented behaviors across the Pacific Northwest. New settlements have appeared virtually overnight in remote areas. The fragments of Stillwater's collective are establishing new communities, preparing to reunite. I've noticed changes in myself too. Sensitivity to sounds I shouldn't be able to hear, unusual clarity of vision at night, a strange pull every November that I fight with every ounce of my being. I don't know how much of their integration took hold before I escaped. If you're in the Northwest and you notice animals moving with unnatural purpose, or if you stumble across a town that isn't on any map, don't stop, don't investigate. Just drive away as fast as you can, because the annual migration is coming again, and this time it won't be contained to one hidden valley. Story 6. I still can't sleep right, even though it's been 2 weeks since it happened. I've told my supervisor I'm feeling sick and need some time off, but I haven't told anyone what really happened that night. I don't think anyone would believe me anyway, but I need to get this off my chest, so here goes. I'm a doctoral student in statistics at the State University, and I've been working the overnight shift at Census Region 317's temporary office since January. The job is perfect for me. Midnight to 8 in the morning, when the building is completely empty. I can focus on data entry during slow periods and work on my dissertation during downtime. The office is on the 3rd floor of the Parkview Professional Building, this old 5-story office building from the 70s that's seen better days. When I started, Director Whitmore gave me this whole speech about confidentiality. "James," he said, "census data is protected by federal law. What happens in this office stays in this office." He was so serious about it that I actually felt important, like I was handling state secrets instead of just typing in how many people lived in each household. Anyway, April 17th started like any other night shift. I got in around 11:45, made a pot of coffee in the break room, and settled in at my desk. It was raining when I arrived, but by midnight it had turned into a full-blown thunderstorm. The kind where lightning flashes so often you could read a book by it, and the thunder makes the windows rattle in their frames. Around 1:30, my computer started acting weird. The screen would flicker whenever lightning struck, which was happening every few minutes. I was entering data from paper forms submitted by field workers, and twice the system froze, making me lose about 20 minutes of work. I called IT support, but at that hour, I only got their automated system telling me to restart my computer. Super helpful. I went to grab more coffee around 2:15, and that's when I heard the elevator ding. This struck me as odd because I was supposed to be alone in the building at night. The security guard only patrolled the ground floor and parking garage, and he never came up to the offices. I figured maybe he was doing an extra check because of the storm. I walked over to the elevator lobby, coffee mug in hand, but when the doors opened, nobody was there. I leaned in and looked around, completely empty. I even waved my hand through the doorway to trigger the sensor, thinking maybe someone was standing to the side, but nope, empty elevator. I chalked it up to an electrical glitch from the storm and headed back to my desk. That's when things got really weird. My computer was typing on its own. I'm not talking about some automated process or update. The cursor was actively moving through fields in the database, entering information about a family named Wilcox. Address, names, ages, all being filled in without anyone touching the keyboard. I stood there frozen, watching it happen. My first thought was that someone had hacked in, remotely, but our systems are completely isolated from the internet for security reasons. The data kept filling in. Thomas Wilcox, age 52, Eleanor Wilcox, age 49, and then it stopped. A message appeared in the notes field. We were counted. Why weren't they? Before I could even process what was happening, the database screen began rapidly populating with submission after submission. Forms were completing themselves faster than any human could possibly type. I lunged for the power button and held it down until the machine shut off, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stood there in the dim light of my desk lamp, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The rain pounded against the windows, and lightning flashed, illuminating the empty office in brief, harsh bursts. I told myself it had to be some kind of system malfunction caused by the storm. Maybe a power surge had corrupted the database. That's when I noticed them. Wet footprints on the carpet leading from the elevator lobby toward the records room. Not muddy footprints like someone had walked in from outside, but wet, like someone who had been standing in water. They definitely hadn't been there when I'd checked the elevator. I should have left. Any rational person would have packed up and gotten the hell out of there. But I convinced myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the roof was leaking somewhere and water was dripping onto the carpet. I decided to follow the trail. The footprints led straight to the records room, where we kept hard copies of previous census data for our region. The door was slightly ajar, with light spilling out into the hallway. I know I hadn't left that light on. I pushed the door open slowly. The room looked like it had been ransacked. File cabinets were open, and folders were scattered across the floor. But it wasn't random. The mess was concentrated around one specific cabinet labeled 1950. In the center of the room was a single census form lying face up on the table. It was for the Wilcox family from the 1950 census. The paper was yellowed with age, but perfectly legible. Thomas and Eleanor Wilcox were listed as the only residents at their address, but there was a handwritten note in the margin from the original census taker. Parents mentioned 2 children, not present during visit, not counted per protocol. As I stood there reading it, the air in the room suddenly felt heavy, like the pressure had changed. My ears popped, and the light bulb overhead flickered. Then the papers on the floor began to move. Not like they were being blown by a draft, they were rising into the air, swirling around the room in a controlled pattern. I backed up against the wall, watching in horror as the pages began to align themselves, stacking and folding and twisting until they formed shapes, human shapes. 4 paper figures stood before me, 2 adult-sized and 2 smaller, child-sized. The adult figures were solid, made from hundreds of densely packed forms. But the children were only partially formed, like someone had tried to sketch them with too few lines. I could see through parts of them to the wall behind. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move. I just stood there as one of the adult figures. I somehow knew it was Thomas Wilcox, extended what should have been an arm toward the census form on the table. "Correct the record," came a sound like rustling papers. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the collective whisper of thousands of sheets of paper moving against each other. They need to be counted. I understood then. Whatever these things were, they wanted me to amend the census record, to include the children who had been left out. What happened to them? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The paper figures shifted, rearranging themselves. For a moment I saw flames in the gaps between the sheets, and I smelled smoke. The child figures seemed to flicker, becoming even more transparent. "House fire," came the paper whisper. "April 3rd, 1950. Census was April 17th. We told them. They didn't count them." I don't know why, but I felt compelled to help them. I stepped forward on shaking legs and picked up the 1950 census form from the table. I found a pen in my pocket, and next to the names of Thomas and Eleanor Wilcox, I added 2 more lines. Thomas Wilcox Jr., age 11, and Eleanor Wilcox Jr., age 7. The moment I finished writing, The air pressure changed again. The paper figures began to collapse, sheets floating gently to the floor like fall leaves. As they descended, I heard a final whisper. "Thank you for counting them." I placed the amended form in a folder marked Amended Records that I found on a nearby shelf, then stumbled out of the records room. The wet footprints were gone. My computer was off, just as I'd left it. The storm had passed and the building was quiet except for the normal hum of the ventilation system. I spent the rest of my shift in the break room, too afraid to go back to my desk or the records room. When Director Whitmore arrived at 8, I was sitting there, staring at the wall, my cold coffee untouched. "James, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I couldn't tell him what happened. Instead, I mumbled something about feeling sick and asked if I could go home early. He agreed, but asked me to check on something in the records room first. My blood ran cold at the request, but I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. When we entered the records room, everything was in perfect order. No scattered papers, no open file cabinets. Director Whitmore went straight to the 1950 section and pulled out the Wilcox family record. I held my breath as he examined it. The form showed 4 names, Thomas and Eleanor Wilcox, and their 2 children, just as I had written them. But my handwriting was gone, replaced by the same neat penmanship as the rest of the form. Director Whitmore nodded, satisfied, and put the folder back. "The system worked as intended," he said cryptically, then walked out. I took 2 weeks off after that night. During that time, I couldn't help but research the Wilcox family. It didn't take long to find the newspaper articles from April 1950. Thomas and Eleanor Wilcox had indeed lost their 2 children in a house fire on April 3rd, just 2 weeks before the census visit. The father had insisted to the census taker that his children should be counted, but the official protocol was clear. Only living residents present on census day were to be recorded. I've been back at work for a few days now. Everything seems normal, but I'm not taking any more night shifts during storms. Director Whitmore has been watching me closely, but he hasn't mentioned anything about that night. Here's the strangest part, though. Last week I was sorting through incoming mail and found a completed census form for the Wilcox family, the current census. Thomas and Eleanor were listed with their birth years matching the 1950 census. They'd be well over 100 years old now if they were still alive. And there, listed as dependents, were their children, still ages 11 and 7, just as they were in 1950. I should have reported it as an error or a prank. Instead, I filed it in a special folder marked Special Processing Division that Director Whitmore had pointed out during my training but never explained. Somehow, I knew that's where it belonged. Every day since then, I've felt like I'm being watched at work. Not in a threatening way, but like someone's making sure I'm doing my job correctly. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, or hear the sound of papers rustling when there's no breeze. And twice now, I've found my computer running the verification program on census records I don't remember queuing up, always families with children. I don't know if I helped put some restless spirits to peace that night, or if I've become part of something I don't understand. All I know is that everyone deserves to be counted, even those who history tried to erase. And whatever happened in that records room during the storm, I can't explain it, but I know it was real. Some nights I still wake up to the sound of rustling papers, even though my apartment is perfectly still. Story 7. I've been putting off writing this for a long time, 7 years now to be exact. I still wake up in cold sweats some nights. My therapist says it might help to get it all down, but I don't know. Some things just feel wrong to put into words. I was a deputy with the Blackwater County Sheriff's Department back in 2016. Small department in rural West Virginia where nothing much happened except the usual. Drunk drivers, domestic disputes, the occasional break-in. I'd been there for about 4 years when Sheriff Dawkins decided to implement a new patrol route covering the area locals called the Hollows. Me and my partner Vanessa Torres got assigned to it. We'd worked together for about 2 years by then. She was smart, quick on her feet, and probably the best shot in the department. I trusted her with my life, which ended up mattering more than I could have known. The Hollows was this isolated area with dense forests and winding roads that twisted through valleys where the sun barely reached in winter. The main stretch was Hollows Road, about 7 miles of poorly maintained asphalt cutting through nothing but trees, with just 4 houses scattered along it. Most were vacation cabins that sat empty most of the year. The first time we drove through, Torres made a joke about how we were being punished for something. "What did you do to piss off Dawkins, Mercer?" she asked me. I laughed it off, but there was something about the place that felt wrong. The trees grew too close to the road, branches reaching out like fingers. The darkness between the trunks seemed deeper than it should be. During briefing, we'd been told the area used to have a small mining community back in the day. Some accident in the 50s killed 17 miners when a tunnel collapsed. The town died soon after, with most buildings either torn down or rotting away in the woods. Nothing remarkable, really. These hills are full of ghost towns with similar stories. Our first couple of patrols were uneventful, boring even. Just driving slowly down empty roads, checking on vacant properties. But about 3 weeks in, things started getting weird. It was late October, already dark by 6 p.m. We were doing our usual sweep when we came across a pile of branches blocking the road about halfway down Hollows Road, not fallen from a storm, deliberately placed. Torres got out to clear them while I kept watch, standard procedure. "This is strange," she said, tossing branches into the ditch. "Some of these were cut, not broken. Someone put these here on purpose." I remember feeling uneasy. Kids, maybe? Halloween pranks? She shook her head. "There's barely anyone living out here, and the nearest house is 2 miles back." We cleared it and continued, but about a mile further, we found another blockade, bigger this time. We reported it to dispatch, cleared it, and finished our patrol. Nothing else happened that night, but it bothered me. Who would block a road hardly anyone used? Over the next 2 weeks, we found roadblocks 5 more times, always in different spots, always clearly deliberate. We never caught anyone in the act. The sheriff told us to keep an eye out, but didn't seem too concerned. "Probably just bored teenagers," he said. Then came the sounds. We were patrolling one night in mid-November when Torres suddenly hit the brakes. "You hear that?" she asked, rolling down her window. At first, I heard nothing but the usual forest sounds. Then it came through. A mechanical grinding noise like heavy machinery, but off somehow, too rhythmic, too steady. It was coming from deep in the woods. "Sounds like mining equipment," I said. Torres frowned. "Active at 11 p.m. out here?" We radioed it in, but dispatch had no record of any permitted operations in the area. We were told to investigate if we could pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to move around us, never getting closer no matter which direction we drove. After that night, we heard the grinding on almost every patrol, sometimes faint, sometimes loud enough to make conversation difficult. We never found the source. Then came the night that still haunts me. November 28th. Torres was driving alone that night. I was out with the flu. I only know what happened because she told me after, her hands shaking around a cup of coffee in the break room. She'd been driving slowly down Hollows Road when her headlights caught something, several somethings, people standing in the road. She said there were at least 5 of them, spaced out across the asphalt, completely motionless. They were covered in what looked like dark material, possibly mining gear. Torres stopped the car and called out to them. No response. They didn't move, didn't speak. She said it was like they didn't even see her. When she activated her spotlight, they scattered into the woods faster than she thought possible. Just gone. The weirdest part? Her patrol car died right after. Battery completely drained. She had to call for a tow and backup. Maintenance replaced her battery the next day, but it happened again a week later. Same road, same spot. I was back on duty by then. We both noticed our radios would cut out in certain areas. Static at first, then complete dead air. Cell phones too. It was like there were dead zones all over the Hollows, but they'd move around. A spot with perfect reception one day would be completely dead the next. By early December, I was starting to dread those. Patrols. I'd never been the superstitious type, but something about the hollows felt wrong. The air seemed heavier there. Torres felt it too, though neither of us really talked about it. What would we say? We're afraid of the dark? We were cops, for Christ's sake. Then came December 3rd, the night everything went to hell. We were doing our usual patrol, both of us in Torres's car since mine was in for maintenance. It was unusually cold that night, frost already forming on the trees. The moon was just a sliver, barely giving any light. About halfway down Hollows Road, Torres suddenly hit the brakes. Standing in the middle of the road was a single figure. Unlike the others she'd seen before, this one was clearly visible even without the headlights. He was wearing what looked like old-fashioned mining equipment, the kind from black and white photos. A helmet with a lamp, heavy coveralls, boots caked with mud. Torres stopped about 30 feet away. We both stared. The figure didn't move. "Sir," I called out, "you need to clear the roadway." No response, no movement. The figure just stood there, lamp on his helmet glowing with a yellowish light that didn't seem to illuminate anything around it. I got out of the car, hand on my holster. "Sir, I need you to step to the side of the road now." As I got closer, I noticed something off about him. His proportions weren't quite right. Too tall, arms hanging too low, and I couldn't see his face beneath the helmet. Just darkness where features should be. That's when I felt it. Like the air suddenly became thick, hard to breathe. A pressure change, like when your ears pop at high altitude, but 100 times worse. My ears rang and I felt dizzy. Behind me, Torres's car died. Headlights, engine, everything. We were in almost complete darkness except for that yellow lamp on the miner's helmet. Then the grinding sound started, louder than ever before, coming from all around us. It wasn't just machinery now. I could hear voices, men shouting orders, the clang of metal on stone, the squeal of cartwheels. It sounded like a fully operational mine shift was happening right there in the dark woods around us. The figure in the road finally moved. He turned slowly and walked into the trees. Without thinking, without radioing in, we followed. I still don't know why. It was like I was in a trance. I remember Torres pulling her flashlight, the beam weak and flickering as we pushed through the underbrush. We'd gone maybe 400 yards when we entered a clearing, and that's where we saw them, dozens of figures moving around in the darkness, all in mining gear, all with those same black void faces. They were performing tasks, digging, hauling, working around what looked like an old mine entrance partially collapsed and grown over with vegetation. One turned toward us, then another. Soon they were all facing us, standing completely still. The grinding sounds continued, but the figures weren't moving anymore, just watching. Torres grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." As if they heard her, they started moving toward us. Not running, just walking steadily. But there were so many, coming from all directions. I drew my weapon. "Stop! Police!" They kept coming. I fired a warning shot. Nothing. They didn't flinch, didn't stop, just kept walking with that same steady pace. Torres was firing too. I remember the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness in strobes, revealing glimpses of those figures getting closer, their blank non-faces, their dirty coveralls. I fired until my magazine was empty. I don't remember running. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. The feeling of branches whipping my face, Torres screaming something I couldn't understand. The grinding noise getting louder, the air getting thicker. The next clear memory I have is waking up in an ambulance. They found us both at dawn, half-conscious, severely dehydrated and hypothermic, despite only being missing for about 6 hours. My gun was empty. Torres had 3 rounds left. When they debriefed us separately, we told the exact same story. Every detail matched. They thought we'd coordinated it somehow, but we hadn't spoken a word to each other between being found and giving our statements. The department investigated the area where they found us. There was an old mine entrance there, exactly as we described. Research showed it was a secondary entrance to the mine that collapsed in the 50s. The real kicker? Locals had been experiencing similar things for decades, always in 20-year cycles since the collapse. No one had ever reported it officially. Who'd believe them? Torres and I both got extensive psych evaluations. They found nothing wrong with us except severe PTSD. We still have the same nightmares, the same flashbacks, despite having no contact during our treatment. The department established roadblocks at both ends of Hollows Road. It's been officially closed ever since. The forest is slowly reclaiming it. I quit the force 6 months later. Torres transferred to another county. I still don't know what happened that night. I've run through every rational explanation, gas leaks causing hallucinations, local legends feeding a shared delusion, even some elaborate prank. None of it fits. All I know is sometimes I still wake up hearing that grinding sound, and when I do, I can feel the air getting thick around me, like something pressing down, trying to pull me back to that clearing in the hollows, where those things with no faces are still working, still waiting in the dark. Story 8. I'm still not sure if I should be writing this down, but I need to tell someone. Maybe putting it out there will help me make sense of what happened, though I doubt it. I've spent years trying to rationalize it, and I'm no closer to an explanation now than I was back in '89. I'd just finished my residency at Johns Hopkins when I accepted the position as head of psychiatry at Glenwood State Hospital in Atchison, Kansas. It wasn't my dream job, but the salary was good, and I'd be running my own department at 34, an opportunity I couldn't pass up. Plus, I needed a fresh start after my divorce. Looking back, I wish I'd just stayed in Baltimore. The hospital was exactly what you'd expect from a facility built in the 1800s, imposing Victorian architecture with high ceilings, narrow corridors, and windows that never seemed to let in enough light. The main building had 5 floors, with patient wards spanning out like tentacles from the central administrative hub. My office was on the 2nd floor down the hall from the staff lounge and across from the medical records room. My predecessor, Dr. Marshall Coleman, had retired suddenly after more than 2 decades at Glenwood. No farewell party, no transition period, just gone. The administrative director, Harold Barnes, brushed it off as health concerns, but the staff exchanged glances whenever Coleman's name came up. I should have recognized the warning signs right there. I spent my first week reviewing patient files and meeting the long-term residents. Glenwood housed about 200 patients, many of whom had been there for decades. The cases were standard for the most part: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression. But I kept finding references to something called counting episodes in the night shift reports. When I asked Nurse Davis about it, she hesitated before answering. Some patients get agitated at night. They count backward. Dr. Coleman had a protocol for it. What kind of protocol? Sedation and isolation until the episode passes. It's all in his notes. Except it wasn't. Coleman's notes were frustratingly vague, full of clinical jargon but light on specific treatment plans. And then there was the locked file cabinet in the corner of my office labeled Ward C Restricted. When I asked Barnes for the key, he claimed not to know anything about it. That section of the hospital has been closed for years, he said. Structural issues, nothing to concern yourself with. I tried to focus on my actual job, but I couldn't stop thinking about Ward C and that locked cabinet. Then the dream started. It always began the same way. I'd be walking down an unfamiliar corridor, the walls a sickly green color, peeling in places to reveal older layers of paint underneath. The lights flickered overhead, and there was a constant dripping sound from somewhere I couldn't locate. At the end of the corridor was a wooden door with a brass plate reading C7, and always there was the counting. A woman's voice, soft but insistent, counting backward from 1,000, 997, 996, 995. The numbers echoed in the darkness, pulling me toward that door. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the numbers still ringing in my ears. After the third night, I knew I wasn't just having anxiety dreams about a new job. The breaking point came during a group therapy session with 6 long-term patients. We were discussing coping mechanisms for auditory hallucinations when Walter, an elderly man who'd been at Glenwood since the 70s, suddenly went rigid in his chair. "She's counting again," he whispered. "Can't you hear her?" The other patients grew agitated. Meredith, a middle-aged woman with paranoid schizophrenia, began to rock back and forth. "Don't listen," she muttered. "If you hear her reach 0, you'll be emptied out." "What happens when you're emptied out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite the chill running down my spine. "You're still here, but you're not you anymore," Walter said. Something else comes in. Something from the other side of the numbers. I ended the session early and immediately pulled their files. Walter, Meredith, and 2 others in the group had all been admitted during Coleman's tenure. All had notes about shared delusion involving a counting woman and night terrors related to mathematical sequences. That evening, I tracked down Marjorie Wilkins, a retired nurse who'd worked at Glenwood for over 30 years before leaving in '85. She lived in a small house just outside Atchison, surrounded by wind chimes that clinked eerily in the autumn breeze. When I mentioned the counting woman, her face went pale. "You need to leave that alone, Dr. Harlow," she said. "Nothing good comes from digging into Ward C." I pressed her for details, and eventually she relented. Over cups of tea that grew cold as she spoke, Marjorie told me about Catherine Doyle. She was a mathematics professor at the university. Brilliant woman. Had a breakdown in '52 and was admitted after claiming she'd discovered a numerical sequence that could open doors between worlds. At first, we thought it was typical delusional thinking, but then strange things started happening. According to Marjorie, Catherine would count backward from 1,000 every night at exactly midnight. Patients in neighboring rooms began to report disturbing dreams, and some started to change. They became vacant, emotionless, going through the motions of daily life without any apparent inner experience. It was like they were hollow inside, Marjorie said. By '59, Dr. Coleman had isolated her in Ward C, which had been unused since the hospital's conversion from a TB sanatorium. He took over her case personally and restricted access to that wing. Before I left, Marjorie grabbed my wrist, her fingers surprisingly strong for a woman in her 70s. "Whatever you do, don't listen to her count all the way down. Don't go into Ward C. Coleman sealed it for a reason." Back at my apartment that night, I couldn't sleep. The dreams came more intensely than before. The corridor seemed more real, the counting louder. I could almost feel the brass doorknob of room C7 under my fingers. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early and searched Coleman's desk again. In the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a false panel, I found a small brass key and a microcassette labeled simply CD. Final session, March 4th, 1983. I locked my office door and played the tape on Coleman's old recorder. Through the static, I could hear 2 voices, Coleman's professional monotone and a woman's soft, precise speech. "The sequence is almost complete," Catherine said. "I've found the spaces between the numbers, Doctor. That's where they wait." "Who waits, Catherine?" Coleman asked. "The ones who want to come through, they need vessels, empty vessels. That's why the counting works. It empties you out, creates a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, Doctor. Something always rushes in to fill it." The tape continued with Catherine explaining her theory about mathematical gateways between dimensions. Coleman's voice grew increasingly agitated as she spoke, until finally he demanded she stop her nightly counting. Catherine laughed, a chilling sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "It's too late. I've already reached 0 once. I'm not Catherine anymore, Doctor. I'm just wearing her now like a coat, and soon there will be more of us." The recording ended abruptly. I sat in silence, telling myself this was just the ramblings of a mentally ill woman and the enabling of a doctor who'd spent too many years in an isolating environment. But the brass key felt heavy in my hand. and I knew where it would lead. I waited until after the evening shift change, when the hospital quieted down. Ward C wasn't on any of the current floor plans, but following my dreams, I made my way to the East Wing's service stairwell. A door marked maintenance only had a newer lock than the others. The brass key fit perfectly. Beyond the door was the green corridor from my dreams, thick with dust and cobwebs. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the oxygen had been slowly leaching away for years. My flashlight beam caught peeling paint and water stains on the ceiling, but otherwise, the hallway was exactly as I'd dreamed it. 7 doors lined the right side of the corridor, each with a brass number plate. I moved slowly toward C7, the beam of my flashlight wobbling as my hand trembled. The counting hadn't started yet, but the silence felt expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Room C7's door was ajar, just a crack. I pushed it open, wincing at the squeal of rusted hinges. The room beyond was larger than a standard patient room, more like a small apartment. A bed, desk, and bookshelf took up one side. The rest of the space was dominated by the walls themselves, covered floor to ceiling with calculations, equations, and numerical sequences written in what looked like chalk, ink, and something darker that I didn't want to identify. In the center of the back wall was a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. Unlike the chaotic scribbles surrounding it, the circle was precisely drawn. As I stared, it seemed to deepen, as if it wasn't drawn on the wall but was a hole in reality itself. 999, 998. I spun around. A woman sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She wore a faded hospital gown, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She shouldn't have been there. The room had been empty when I entered, but she looked as if she'd been waiting for me. 997. Catherine Doyle? My voice cracked. She smiled without pausing her count. 996. 995. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to slam the door, to forget I'd ever found this place. Instead, I took a step forward. You can't be here. You'd be over 90 years old now. 994. 993. As she counted, the circle on the wall seemed to darken, as if a Ua's shadow was growing deeper within it. The air in the room felt thinner, and I found myself gasping slightly. What is this? I asked. What are you doing? 992, 991. Don't you already know, Dr. Harlow? You've been dreaming about this moment for weeks. She knew my name. How could she know my name? 990. I backed toward the door, but it swung shut with a definitive click. The counting continued, each number seemingly drawing more substance from the air, from me. The circle on the wall was now a void, a darkness deeper than absence of light. Stop, I whispered. Please, stop counting. Catherine's smile widened, revealing teeth too perfectly white, too uniformly shaped. 989, 988. It doesn't work that way. Once the counting starts, it must reach 0. Someone must be emptied. Someone must be filled. The next part is harder to explain. I remember Catherine continuing to count, her voice growing stronger as mine faded away. I remember the circle expanding, or perhaps I was being drawn toward it. There was a cold so intense it burned, and a sensation of being turned inside out, examined and then discarded as unsuitable. And then nothing. They found me 3 days later in the hospital cafeteria, staring at a wall. I have no memory of how I got there or what happened during those days. In my pocket was the brass key and a notebook containing numbers counting backward from 1,000, written in my handwriting but not in my style. Barnes had Ward C demolished the following month. I was transferred to a facility in Maryland for recovery, though no one could explain what I was recovering from. I spent 6 months there before being cleared to practice again, but I never returned to Glenwood. I still hear the counting sometimes, usually at night when the world grows quiet. It picks up wherever it left off, continuing its relentless progression towards zero. I've tried medication, therapy, even hypnosis, but nothing stops the numbers. The strangest part? Sometimes I catch myself counting aloud in a voice that doesn't quite sound like mine. And when I look in the mirror during these episodes, I swear I see something else looking back at me from behind my eyes, something patient and ancient that's just waiting for the counting to reach zero. I don't know what happened in Ward C that night. I don't know if Catherine Doyle was real or a manifestation of my own mental breakdown. All I know is that I'm terrified of what will happen when the counting finally stops. Story 9. I still can't sleep without checking every window and door 3 times. It's been 4 months since that night, but I still wake up in cold sweats thinking I hear tapping on the glass. My therapist says writing about it might help, so here goes. I've lived in Ashfield for almost 3 years now. It's one of those neighborhoods where people actually wave to each other and bring casseroles when someone new moves in. My little 2-bedroom house isn't anything special, but it's mine, the first place I've owned after years of renting. The front yard has these overgrown hydrangeas that bloom like crazy in summer, and the backyard backs up to a small wooded area that gives it a private feel. That Sunday started like any other. I remember it was early October, and we'd just had that first real cool snap of fall. I spent the afternoon cleaning and meal prepping for the week ahead. Around 6 in the evening, I was washing dishes when I got this weird sensation. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you? That prickly awareness that raises the hair on your neck? I glanced out my kitchen window and noticed someone standing across the street. Just standing there, looking at my house. They were wearing dark clothes, maybe a hoodie, and seemed to be a medium height and build. Nothing remarkable, which somehow made it creepier. The sun was setting, so I couldn't make out their face clearly. I tried to brush it off. Probably just some bored teenager, I told myself. Maybe a new neighbor checking out the area. But something felt off. The way they were so still, so focused. I closed my blinds and tried to focus on the Netflix show I'd been watching, but I kept pausing it to peek through the blinds. They stayed for nearly an hour before walking away. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about that person, wondering if they'd come back. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Monday was busy with work. I'm a graphic designer and had a big project due, so I was glued to my computer all day. As the afternoon wore on, I realized I'd barely moved from my desk. My back was stiff, and my eyes were burning from staring at the screen for hours. The house was quiet, too quiet. I started to feel that sensation again, like someone was watching me. I got up to make some tea, trying to shake off the feeling. It was around 9 p.m. when I heard it, a soft tapping sound from my living room windows. My heart immediately started pounding. I stood frozen in the kitchen, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. There it was again. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and slowly walked toward the living room. The blinds were closed, but there are these small gaps where they don't quite meet the windowsill. I peered through, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the knife. Nothing, just my empty front yard illuminated by the streetlight. I started to relax, thinking maybe it was just a branch or something hitting the window. Then came a much louder knock, from my front door this time. 3 distinct knocks that seemed to echo through the entire house. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Who would be at my door at this hour? None of my friends would stop by this late without texting first. I crept to the door, knife still in hand, and looked through the peephole. There was no one there, just my empty porch and the dark street beyond. That's when my phone rang. I almost screamed. The caller ID showed unknown number. Something told me not to answer it, but my hand moved almost on its own. I picked up but didn't say anything. After a few seconds of silence, a voice whispered, "Check the porch." My blood turned to ice. I hung up immediately and backed away from the door. My instincts were screaming at me to stay inside, to not look. But there was this horrible curiosity I couldn't fight. I moved back to the door and looked through the small frosted glass panel beside it. Something moved outside. I couldn't see clearly through the textured glass, just a dark shape shifting on my porch. That was enough for me. I ran back to the kitchen, grabbed my cell phone, and called 911. The dispatcher told me to stay inside with the doors locked until officers arrived. Those 15 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat in my bathroom, the only room without windows, clutching my phone and that kitchen knife. When the police finally arrived, they searched my yard and the surrounding area, but found nothing suspicious. One officer, a middle-aged guy with kind eyes, suggested it might be neighborhood kids playing pranks. "Halloween's coming up," he said with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We get calls like this all the time." They left after about 30 minutes, promising to keep an eye on my street during their patrols. I thanked them, but I knew they thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was. I tried to go back to work, thinking it would distract me, but I couldn't focus. Around midnight, I got up to make more tea, anything to keep me awake because there was no way I was sleeping. That's when I saw it. The figure was back, standing under a streetlight about 3 houses down. But something was different. I could swear they were wearing different clothes than earlier. Their hair seemed different too. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I must be mistaken or exhausted. But when I looked again, they were still there. I watched, paralyzed, as they slowly raised a hand and waved at me. Not a friendly wave, slow and deliberate, like they knew I was watching them. I dropped to the floor beneath my window, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My phone rang again, unknown number. I rejected the call and turned my phone off completely. When I gathered the courage to peek out again, the figure was gone. But then I spotted them again, now standing in a different spot closer to my house. They were definitely wearing different clothes. How was that possible? Had they changed, or was it a different person altogether? This pattern continued throughout the night. I'd see the figure. They'd disappear into the shadows, and then reappear somewhere else, always in different clothing, always in a different position, always closer to my house. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind from fear and exhaustion. I spent the entire night awake, moving from room to room, keeping all the lights off so they couldn't see me. At one point, around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something on my roof. Soft footsteps moving across the shingles. I sat in my hallway closet for nearly an hour after that, knife in hand, barely breathing. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Surely whatever was happening would stop in daylight. I made myself a strong cup of coffee with trembling hands and tried to convince myself I'd imagined most of it. That's when I saw them, scattered across my front porch like some sick greeting card. Photographs, at least a dozen of them. I opened my front door just enough to grab them, terrified that someone might be waiting to grab me. What I saw made my knees buckle. They were pictures of me, inside my house, me cooking dinner, me working at my desk, me watching TV on my couch, me brushing my teeth, all taken through my windows, from different angles, on different days. In some, I was wearing pajamas I'd worn several nights ago. In others, clothes from last week. This hadn't just started Sunday. This person had been watching me for days, maybe weeks. I called the police again, this time in hysterics. The same officer came back with a partner. They took the photos as evidence and promised to increase patrols in the area. They asked if I had anyone who might want to scare or harm me. An ex, a disgruntled colleague, anyone. I couldn't think of anyone. I'm not the type of person who makes enemies. I called my parents who live 3 hours away. They arrived that afternoon and helped me install security cameras and new locks. I stayed with them at a hotel that night, and the next while we waited for a security system to be installed. They wanted me to come stay with them, but I refused to be driven from my home. It's been 4 months now. The police never found who did it. The cameras haven't caught anything suspicious. No more photos have appeared. The phone calls stopped, but the feeling of being watched never has. I still check and double-check my locks. I've covered every window with blackout curtains. I've mapped out every possible hiding spot within 100 yards of my house. I keep pepper spray in every room. Sometimes at night, I still think I see movement in the shadows outside, a figure watching from just beyond the reach of my security lights. I've thought about moving, but the truth is, I don't think it would matter. Whoever they are, they found me once. They could find me again. The worst part isn't the fear of what they might do. It's living with the knowledge that they succeeded in what they set out to do. They made me feel vulnerable in my own home, made me know they could see me when I couldn't see them. I don't know if they're still out there watching. I don't know if they'll ever come back, but I do know one thing. I'll never feel completely safe again. And I think that's exactly what they wanted. Story 10. I don't typically share personal stuff online, but I need to get this off my chest. I've been replaying it in my mind for months now, and I still can't make sense of it. Maybe writing it down will help, or maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I work for a catering service in Porteras. Not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills. The worst part is the late nights. We often finish events well after midnight, and then I have to load all the equipment into the van and drive it back to the warehouse. About 6 months ago, on a Tuesday in April, we catered a corporate event that ran way longer than scheduled. By the time I finished packing everything up, it was almost 2 in the morning. I'd been working since 10 a.m., so I was running on fumes and those nasty energy drinks that taste like liquid chemicals. My stomach was growling so loud it could have scared off a stray dog. There's this 24-hour fast food place on the edge of town, one of those chain restaurants with the bright yellow sign. I don't usually eat that junk, but at 2 a.m. with an empty stomach and a 14-hour shift behind me, it looked like gourmet dining. The drive-through had 3 cars ahead of me, which was weird for that time on a weeknight. While waiting, I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone when something caught my eye in the parking lot. There was this old sedan. I think it was a dark blue or black Chevrolet, maybe from the early 2000s. What struck me as odd was how it was parked in reverse in the far corner of the lot, facing the drive-through lane. The windows were heavily tinted, even the front windshield, which I'm pretty sure isn't legal here. I didn't think too much of it at the time. When I finally got my food, a double cheeseburger, large fries, and a chocolate shake, I was too focused on eating to care about some random car. But as I pulled away from the drive-through window, I noticed the car hadn't moved. No one had gotten out, no interior lights had come on. It was just sitting there. Instead of eating in the parking lot, I decided to drive to this nature reserve about 5 minutes away. There's a scenic overlook there where you can see the whole town lit up at night. Back in high school, my friends and I used to go there to hang out, have a few beers away from our parents. I hadn't been there in years, but suddenly I felt nostalgic. The reserve has this small gravel parking lot at the base of a short hiking trail that leads to the overlook. When I pulled in, it was completely empty. Not surprising at nearly 2:30 in the morning. I parked facing the trailhead, killed the engine, and turned on my interior light so I could see my food. I had just unwrapped my burger when headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. The brightness made me squint, and for a second, I couldn't see what kind of car it was. But as it pulled into the lot, my stomach dropped. It was the same dark sedan from the fast food place. The car drove slowly across the gravel, the sound of rocks crunching under its tires impossibly loud in the quiet night. It parked about 30 meters behind me, not directly behind, but offset to my left. Then the headlights went off and the engine died. I sat there frozen, burger halfway to my mouth, waiting for something to happen. Maybe they were just other late-night workers looking for a quiet place to eat. But no one got out. No interior lights came on. The car just sat there in the darkness. I tried to tell myself I was being paranoid. Plenty of people knew about this spot. It was just a coincidence. Still, my appetite was gone, replaced by a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I put my food down and called my friend Kayo. He lives about 10 minutes from the reserve and has always been the type who'd show up anytime, day or night. "Hey man, Sorry to call so late, I whispered, not sure why I was keeping my voice down. Lucas, what's up? He sounded groggy but alert. I'm at the old overlook, and there's this car that I think followed me from the drive-thru. They're just sitting there watching me, and I'm getting a weird feeling. Am I overreacting? There was a pause before Kaio answered. Probably nothing, but I'll come check it out. Give me 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes were the longest of my life. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the car hadn't moved. No lights, no movement, nothing. Just a dark silhouette against the trees. When Kaio's pickup finally pulled into the lot, I nearly cried with relief. He parked next to me, and I got out to meet him, bringing my phone and keys but leaving my untouched food on the passenger seat. So, where's this creepy car? Kaio asked, looking around the parking lot. I pointed behind us. That one, the dark sedan. It followed me from the fast food place. Kaio studied it for a moment. Weird spot to park. Want to get out of here? Actually, I said, surprising myself, I kind of want to walk up to the overlook now that you're here. I haven't been there in years. I'm not sure why I suggested it. Maybe I thought having Kaio there made everything okay, or maybe I was trying to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. Whatever the reason, Kaio shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" We started up the trail, the gravel crunching under our feet. The path isn't long, maybe 200 meters, but it winds through some trees before opening up to the overlook. I kept glancing back toward the parking lot, which you could partially see through the trees. That's when I saw them. 4 men had gotten out of the sedan simultaneously. All 4 doors were open, and they were standing beside the car, looking at each other across the roof. They weren't talking or moving, just staring at each other in this bizarre, synchronized way. Even from a distance, there was something deeply unsettling about it, like they were communicating without words. "Kaio," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Look." He turned and watched for a moment. "Okay, that's fucking weird. Let's go back to our cars." But before we could move, the men shut their doors in unison, and 3 of them started walking toward the trailhead. The 4th stayed by the car, leaning against it. "Shit, they're coming up," I said, my heart pounding. "Let's just keep going to the overlook," Kaio said. "It's open space there. If they try anything, we run back down. There are 2 of us, and we know these trails." It wasn't a great plan, but we were already halfway to the overlook, and something told me we shouldn't turn around and face those men on the narrow trail. So we kept going, faster now, reaching the clearing at the top in less than a minute. The overlook is a flat, rocky area with a low stone wall along the edge. Below, you can see the twinkling lights of Porteras spread out like a carpet of stars. On any other night, it would have been beautiful. We turned to face the trail, backs to the overlook, waiting. I could hear my pulse in my ears, drowning out the night sounds of the forest. The 3 men emerged from the trail a minute later. They were all wearing dark clothes, jeans and hoodies or jackets. In the moonlight, I could make out their faces. They looked normal enough, probably in their late 20s or early 30s. One was tall and thin with a beard, one was stockier with short hair, and the third was average height with a baseball cap. They stopped when they saw us, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then the bearded one raised his hand in what might have been a friendly gesture. "Hey there," he called out, his voice casual. "Nice night, huh?" Kaio and I exchanged glances. This wasn't what we expected. "Yeah," Kaio answered cautiously, "just showing my friend the view." The 3 men walked closer, spreading out slightly as they approached. The one with the cap spoke next. "We saw you at the drive-thru earlier," he said, looking directly at me. "Thought we'd follow you, see where you were headed." My blood ran cold. They were openly admitting to following me. "Why would you do that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The stocky one shrugged. "Just curious. Not many people come out here this late." Something was very wrong about their behavior. Too calm, too rehearsed. And there was that 4th man, still down by the cars. Where was he? "We were just leaving," Kaio said firmly, taking a step to the side to create a path back to the trail. The bearded man's expression changed subtly. "You just got here. Why not enjoy the view a little longer?" That's when I noticed the gap in their formation. They had positioned themselves to block our most direct route back to the trail, but there was a space between the bearded man and the stocky one. I nudged Kaio and nodded toward the gap. He understood immediately. "Actually, we need to go," I said, and we both suddenly bolted through the opening. The men reacted instantly, all pretense of friendliness gone. They lunged toward us, but we had the advantage of surprise and made it to the trailhead before they could grab us. As we started down the path, I glanced back and saw the fourth man. He was halfway up the trail, partially hidden among the trees. In his hand was something I couldn't identify, something long and metallic that caught the moonlight. We tore down that trail like our lives depended on it, because I truly believe they did. Behind us, I could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth, no longer trying to be subtle. We reached the parking lot and sprinted to our vehicles. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Kaio was already in his pickup, engine roaring to life. I finally got my door open and threw myself inside, locking it instantly. Through the windows, I could see the men emerging from the trail running toward us. I started the engine and reversed so fast I nearly hit Kaio's truck. We both peeled out of that lot, gravel flying everywhere. I followed Kaio for about 10 minutes, taking random turns through town to make sure we weren't being followed, before we finally stopped on his street. We sat in our cars, engines running, catching our breath. "What the fuck was that?" Kaio asked when I rolled down my window. "I don't know," I said, my voice still shaky, "but I think they were planning to rob us, or worse." We agreed to meet at the police station the next morning to file a report. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every sound outside my apartment. At the station, the officer took our statements but didn't seem particularly concerned. "Probably just some guys messing around," he said. "Unless they actually threatened you or showed weapons, there's not much we can do." I had a blurry photo of the bearded guy that I'd managed to take at the overlook. On a hunch, we showed it to one of the employees at the fast food place later that day. The girl behind the counter went pale when she saw it. "That's Miguel," she said quietly. "He used to work here until he got fired for harassing Sarah, one of our managers. She has a restraining order against him now." She told us Miguel had been stalking his ex-girlfriend for months, showing up at her workplace, her home, following her around town. The night I saw him, she wasn't even working, but for some reason, he and his friends decided to follow me instead. I still don't understand why they targeted me. Was it random? Did they mistake me for someone else? Or were they just looking for anyone vulnerable and alone that night? I haven't been back to that fast food place or the nature reserve since then. I take different routes home from work, and I never drive alone at night if I can help it. Sometimes I still see dark sedans with tinted windows in my rearview mirror, and my heart stops until they turn off or pass me. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. Story 11. I've been hauling freight for 19 years now. 19 years of highways, truck stops, and tight schedules. You learn a lot in that time. How to navigate back roads when interstates are jammed, which truck stops have decent showers, and most importantly, you learn to trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. That gut feeling saved me last November, and maybe my life too. It was a Friday evening in November of 2022. I'd picked up a standard container of vacuum-sealed electronics from a distribution center in the morning. Nothing special, just another load heading to a warehouse about 300 miles away. I'd done this run dozens of times before. The manifest was all in order. Tracking details, weight specifications, security codes, recipient information, everything by the book. I was about 2 hours from my destination when my phone buzzed. A message from dispatch popped up. New delivery address, sensitive cargo, confirm immediately. Then there was a map location attached. No company name, no contact person. Something immediately felt wrong. In all my years driving, address changes followed strict protocols. There's always a call from dispatch, a new manifest, signature forms, a whole process. This was just a text message with coordinates. I pulled into a truck stop to fuel up and check this out properly. The big diesel engines around me were rumbling, drivers milling around getting coffee, normal evening stuff. I logged into our scheduling platform on my tablet and checked my delivery details. According to the system, nothing had changed. The original manifest was still active. I called dispatch and asked about the message. The voice that answered wasn't my regular dispatcher. "There's no change in the system," I said. "I need verbal confirmation before changing route." There was a pause before they responded with, "Driver delay recorded. Proceed as quickly as possible to avoid penalty." That wasn't right. We don't talk like that. Nobody threatens drivers with penalties for asking questions about cargo. Safety and verification are drilled into us from day one. I should have turned around right then, but I've been in this business long enough to know sometimes things get messed up. Maybe the system hadn't updated yet. Maybe there was some urgent situation with the client. I decided I'd at least check out the location before making a final decision. I punched the coordinates into my GPS. It was about 30 minutes away, in an industrial area I wasn't familiar with. As I drove, darkness fell completely. The roads got narrower, less maintained. The GPS took me off the main highway onto a secondary road, then onto what was barely more than a service road with broken asphalt. No streetlights out here, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. The buildings became more spread out, many of them looking vacant or neglected. I started feeling increasingly uneasy. This wasn't a normal commercial area. Finally, the GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination." I slowed down, scanning the area. There was a long warehouse building with rolled-down shutters. No company signage, no trucks in the loading area. Just a single light near what looked like a back entrance. The place looked abandoned, except for that one light. I pulled up near the entrance but kept my distance. I didn't park at the loading dock like I normally would. Something told me to stay ready to leave. I kept the engine running. As I was looking at the building, two men emerged from a side door. One was tall and bald, already operating a forklift. The other wore an orange hoodie with no logo, no company name. Neither had ID badges visible, no clipboard, no manifest reader, nothing you'd expect from receiving personnel, just work gloves and a strange sense of confidence, like they'd been waiting specifically for me. The guy in the orange hoodie approached my truck, but I kept my window closed. He gestured for me to roll it down. I cracked it just enough to speak. "Is this the drop point for Unit 19B?" I asked. The bald man nodded. "Bring it around to Dock 2, he said, pointing to one of the shuttered entrances. "I need to call dispatch first to confirm," I said. "This wasn't my original destination." The man in the orange hoodie looked at me with this smile that lasted too long. His face was illuminated by my cab light, and there was something off about his expression. "Why would you do that?" he asked. The tone was casual, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it that made the hair on my neck stand up. I told them I needed to verify the delivery change, standard procedure. The bald man glanced at his partner, then back at me. Neither seemed bothered by my hesitation, which bothered me even more. If this was legitimate, they'd be annoyed by the delay. I pulled out my phone, making sure they could see me dialing, and called the actual dispatch number, not responding to the text. My regular dispatcher answered. "Hey, it's Raphael. I got a message about a delivery address change for my current load. Can you confirm that?" There was confusion on the other end. "What message?" "Your route hasn't changed, Raphael. You're still delivering to the Brightline warehouse in Cedar Park." I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained about the text. The dispatcher sounded immediately concerned. "That didn't come from us. Where are you right now?" When I described my location, his voice became urgent. "Get out of there immediately. I'm calling security." I looked out the window. The forklift operator was already moving toward the back of my truck. The guy in the orange hoodie was walking closer, waving his arms like he was trying to get my attention. I dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, threw the truck into reverse and backed up fast. I hit some pallets stacked behind me, heard them crash and scatter, but I kept going until I could swing around. I shifted into drive and accelerated onto the road, not looking back until I'd gone a few hundred yards. In my mirrors, I could see the two men standing in the road, watching me drive away. They didn't run or shout, they just stood there, which somehow made it even more unnerving. I called dispatch back once I was on the main road. They told me to get to the nearest well-lit public place and that they were contacting the police. I headed for a gas station about 15 minutes away, constantly checking my mirrors. About 5 minutes after leaving that warehouse, I noticed headlights behind me, a pickup truck moving fast. It caught up to me quickly and stayed right on my tail. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it matched my speed exactly. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. The pickup followed me for nearly 10 kilometers before dropping back when I pulled into the brightly lit gas station. It drove past slowly, and I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I felt them looking at me as they passed. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I gave them all the information I had, the text message, the warehouse location, descriptions of the men. They took my statement and said they'd check it out. I stayed at that gas station until another officer called to tell me they'd gone to the warehouse. It was empty, completely locked up and dark, like no one had been there all night. The officer said the property had been vacant for months, according to the real estate company that owned it. They found some scattered pallets where I'd backed into them, but no other signs anyone had been there. The police theory was that it was a sophisticated cargo theft operation. They'd been targeting high-value electronics shipments. They had somehow gotten information about my cargo and route. The text was a forgery, copying our company's real format, even using the standard signature line from our dispatchers. What bothers me most, even now, wasn't violence or chaos. There wasn't any. It was how calm and calculated the whole thing was. How efficient. These weren't desperate people. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had equipment ready. They knew what I was carrying. They knew my route. They had a forklift waiting. If I'd backed my truck up to that loading dock, I'm certain my container would have disappeared, and who knows what would have happened to me. Maybe they'd have just let me go. Maybe not. I still think about that sometimes. Since that night, I've completely changed my protocol. I verify all messages with phone calls. I check names twice. I record everything. I've warned other drivers about what happened. Some of them have heard similar stories from other regions. The police never caught them. The case is still open, but I doubt anything will come of it now. Those men are probably still out there, waiting for drivers who don't ask questions. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and see a single light on in a distant warehouse, I think about those men. The tall, bald one operating the forklift. The one in the orange hoodie with that smile that lasted too long. And I wonder how many drivers weren't as lucky as I was. Story 12. I've never been the type to believe in ghosts. I was a journalism major, trained to look for facts, evidence, things I could prove. But what happened during Easter break in 1998 completely changed how I see the world. I'm still processing it all these years later, and honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever fully make sense of it. I was 21 and home from college for the holiday weekend. My parents had decided to go on a cruise that year, so I went to stay with my grandmother in her old Victorian house in western Massachusetts. It's this beautiful place that's been in our family for generations, all creaky wooden floors and narrow staircases, sitting on a few acres of land outside a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. My grandmother, Margaret, was 79 then. She'd always been this pillar of strength in our family, opinionated, sharp as a tack, and private about certain things. I'd always noticed how she avoided talking about her sister Ruth, who supposedly ran off with some traveling salesman back in the 30s. Whenever Ruth's name came up at family gatherings, the conversation would shift so abruptly you could practically hear the brakes squeal. The weather that Easter weekend was typical New England spring, sunny but with this bitter chill that cut right through you. I arrived Friday afternoon to find Gran already baking hot cross buns in the kitchen, the whole house smelling like cinnamon and cloves. "Eliza, sweetheart," she said, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron before giving me a hug. "I'm so glad you're here." There was something off about her, though. A tightness around her eyes, a nervousness I wasn't used to seeing. I chalked it up to her getting older, maybe not being used to having house guests anymore. That first night we had dinner together and caught up. I told her about my journalism classes, the internship I was hoping to get at the Boston Globe that summer. Gran listened attentively, but I kept catching her glancing out the kitchen window toward the old carriage house that sat about 50 yards from the main house. The carriage house was this weathered wooden structure that hadn't been used for its original purpose since cars replaced horses. My dad had converted part of it into a workshop when I was a kid, but I remembered it mostly being used for storage. What was strange was that Gran had recently installed a heavy padlock on the door. When I asked about it, she muttered something about keeping the neighborhood kids from snooping around and quickly changed the subject. That night, I woke up around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom. As I passed by the window in the hallway, something caught my eye. A light flickering in the carriage house window, just for a second, then gone. I figured it was probably just moonlight reflecting off the glass, but something about it unsettled me. The next morning was Saturday, the day before Easter. Gran seemed even more on edge, dropping a teacup during breakfast and nearly jumping out of her skin when the phone rang. While she was busy preparing food for Sunday's dinner, I decided to poke around the attic, looking for old family photos for a genealogy project I'd been thinking about starting. In a dusty trunk beneath some quilts, I found a small wooden box filled with photographs from the 1930s. Most were typical family shots, stiff poses, serious faces. But one caught my attention. A young woman, maybe 18 or 19, with dark wavy hair and a smile that seemed to light up the photo. She was wearing a blue dress with small white flowers on it, standing in front of the carriage house. When I turned the photo over, I saw Ruth, Easter, 1938, written in faded ink. So this was the mysterious great-aunt no one talked about. She didn't look like someone who'd abandoned her family. There was something about her eyes that seemed so alive, so present. I brought the photo downstairs to show Gran. When I walked into the kitchen, she was staring out the window at the carriage house again, so lost in thought she didn't hear me come in. I cleared my throat and she startled. "Gran, I found this in the attic," I said, holding out the photograph. "Is this your sister, Ruth?" The blood drained from her face. She took the photo with trembling hands and sank into a kitchen chair. "You shouldn't be poking around in those old things," she said, but there was no real anger in her voice, just a deep, profound exhaustion. "What really happened to her, Gran?" I asked gently. The traveling salesman's story never made much sense to me. Gran just shook her head and tucked the photo into her apron pocket. "Some stories are better left untold, Eliza." That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I got up and looked out my window. The moon was nearly full, casting a silvery glow over the property. The carriage house stood like a dark sentinel against the night sky, and then I smelled it, a faint, sweet scent of lily of the valley perfume. It wasn't Gran's usual rose water, and it seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. As I stood there, puzzled by the phantom scent, I noticed something hanging on a hook by my bedroom door that I hadn't seen before. An old-fashioned skeleton key with an ornate handle. I'm not sure what compelled me, but I took the key and quietly made my way downstairs and out the back door. The grass was wet with dew as I crossed the yard, the moonlight bright enough that I didn't need a flashlight. When I reached the carriage house, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The padlock looked modern, but to my surprise, there was also an old keyhole in the door itself. I tried the skeleton key, and with a heavy click, the door unlocked. The smell of lily of the valley grew stronger as I stepped inside. Moonlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating old furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked against walls, and my dad's abandoned workbench. Nothing seemed unusual, but the air felt heavy, charged somehow. I moved cautiously through the space, not entirely sure what I was looking for. Near the back of the carriage house was a section of floor that looked different from the rest. The boards were newer, a slightly different color than the weathered planks surrounding them, and one board wasn't quite flush with the others. I found a rusty crowbar hanging on the wall and, after a moment's hesitation, wedged it under the uneven floorboard. It took all my strength, but the board finally lifted with a groan of nails pulling free from old wood. Beneath it was dark, packed earth. But there was something else, a corner of fabric, discolored with age. My hands were shaking as I used the crowbar to widen the opening, prying up a second board. The fabric was wrapped around something long and narrow. I reached down to touch it, and a chill shot up my arm. I knew somehow that I was touching human remains. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. That's when I heard the carriage house door open behind me. I wondered when you'd find her. My grandmother stood in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by moonlight. She didn't seem angry or surprised, just deeply sad. "Gran, what? Who is—" I couldn't form a complete sentence. She came in and slowly lowered herself to sit on an old trunk. "That's Ruth, my sister, my beautiful, headstrong sister." The story came out in halting sentences. Ruth hadn't run away with a salesman. She'd been seeing a young man from one of the wealthiest families in the county, Richard Kensington. He was handsome, charming, and already being groomed for a political career. When Ruth tried to end things, he couldn't accept it. On Easter Sunday, 1938, she went to meet him one last time. She never came home. "We reported her missing," Gran said, her voice hollow. "But the sheriff was in the Kensington's pocket. They suggested she'd run off, and everyone was encouraged to believe that story." A year later, my great-grandfather found Ruth's remains while hunting in the woods on Kensington property. Rather than go to authorities who would likely bury the truth, the family made the agonizing decision to bring her home secretly. They buried her beneath the carriage house floor, where they could keep watch over her. Richard Kensington went on to become a county judge, Gran said bitterly. Lived a respected life until his peaceful death in 1982. Never paid for what he did. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process it all. "But why are you telling me now? Why not report it, even after he died?" "Because of what happens every Easter," Gran whispered. "That's when she's most restless. That's when she tries to tell people what happened to her." Gran explained the inexplicable things that had been happening for 60 years. Ruth's perfume appearing out of nowhere, her favorite hymn somehow playing on a broken phonograph, children reporting seeing a young woman in a blue dress watching from the carriage house windows. The family had kept the carriage house locked on Easter Sunday for decades, trying to contain Ruth's restless spirit. "I think she led you to the key," Gran said. "She wants to be found. She wants justice." That night changed everything. With my encouragement, Gran went to the authorities the following week. Modern forensic investigators confirmed the remains were Ruth's and matched evidence from the original missing persons file that had been deliberately overlooked due to Kensington's connections. After 60 years, Ruth received a proper burial in the town cemetery, and the haunting phenomena, the perfume, the music, the sightings, stopped completely. I ended up changing my career focus after graduation. I wrote a book about Ruth's case that led to the reopening of several other unsolved disappearances linked to Judge Kensington. 3 other families finally got answers about loved ones who had vanished during that era. What I experienced that Easter weekend haunts me still, but not in a frightening way. Sometimes I catch a faint whiff of Lily of the Valley, just for a moment, and I wonder if Ruth is still watching over our family. I don't tell many people this story. It sounds too unbelievable, but I know what happened. I know who led me to that key, to those floorboards, to a 60-year-old secret that refused to stay buried. Some truths refuse to stay hidden, no matter how deep you try to bury them. And sometimes the dead find ways to speak. Story 13. I've never really told this story in full before. Even now, 2 years later, my hands get shaky just thinking about it. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I used to work the night shift at a data center in Oak Ridge. Nothing fancy, just monitoring systems and restarting them when they went down. The pay was decent, and I liked the solitude. Most nights, I'd just watch shows, do some reading, or play games between my rounds checking the equipment. The facility was at the end of this long access road surrounded by dense forest. I mean, completely isolated. During the day, it wasn't so bad with other employees around, but at night, it was just me and acres of humming servers. The building itself was split into 2 sections, the main server farm where all the equipment was housed, and a smaller administration building where I had my office. This happened on a Tuesday night in November. I remember because I'd been excited about a new episode of this show I was following. It was around 2 in the morning when one of the monitors showed a system disconnection in the storage hall. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes cables would work themselves loose from vibrations, or a system would need a reset. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the server farm. The storage hall was at the very back of the building, probably the furthest point from my office. The only sounds were the constant hum of cooling systems and my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. When I reached the affected server rack, I noticed right away something was off. This wasn't just a loose connection. A heavy-duty power cable was completely unplugged and lying on the floor. These cables don't just fall out, they're designed to lock in place. Someone would have had to physically disconnect it. My first thought was that the day shift had been doing maintenance and forgot to reconnect it. It happened sometimes, though rarely with main power cables. I plugged it back in, watching the system lights flicker back to life. That's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a heavy door closing somewhere in the building. I froze. I wasn't supposed to be alone, but I absolutely was. We used electronic key cards to enter the facility, and mine was the only one that had registered after 8 that evening. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the ventilation system creating pressure that made a door sound like it closed. Data centers have all kinds of weird sounds if you're not used to them. I hurried back to my office in the admin building, trying to shake off the unease. I checked the security monitors, but they only covered the perimeter of the building and the main entrances, not the interior hallways. Everything looked normal. I settled back at my desk and pulled up my show, trying to distract myself. About 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps. Not the kind that make you wonder if you actually heard something. These were clear, hurried footsteps in the corridor outside my office. My office door was closed, and through the small window in it, I could see part of the hallway. There was nothing visible, but the footsteps had stopped too. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking a bit. "Security?" I thought maybe my supervisor had come to check on me, though that had never happened before. Silence. I reached for the phone on my desk, thinking I should call the actual security company that monitored the building remotely. But before I could dial, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from my door. Here's where I made my first mistake. Instead of staying put and calling security, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a screwdriver from my desk drawer. Pathetic, I know, but it was the closest thing to a weapon I had, and opened my office door. The corridor was empty and dimly lit by emergency lighting. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "This is a secure facility. Identify yourself." Nothing. I started walking down the hallway, checking the other offices. All the doors were closed and locked, as they should be at night. I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing when one of the doors at the end of the hall suddenly swung open. A dark figure rushed out. I can't even describe the terror that shot through me. It was like my blood turned to ice. The figure was tall, dressed entirely in black, and moving with purpose, directly toward me. I couldn't make out any features in the dim light, just this human-shaped darkness closing the distance between us. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted back down the corridor, past my office and toward the stairs. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. The screwdriver was still clutched in my hand, but there was no way I was going to stop and confront whoever, or whatever, was chasing me. The stairwell door felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as I yanked it open and practically threw myself down the stairs. I nearly fell several times, my shaking legs barely keeping up with the rest of my body. I hit the ground floor and slammed through the emergency exit, setting off the alarm. The cold night air hit my face as I sprinted across the parking lot to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, fumbling for my phone to call the police. As I waited for them to answer, I looked back at the building. The emergency door I'd exited was still open, the alarm blaring into the night, but there was no sign of the intruder. They hadn't followed me outside. That realization somehow made it worse. Why hadn't they followed me? Where had they gone? When the police arrived about 20 minutes later, I was still sitting in my car, engine running, watching the building. They took my statement and then, with me trailing behind them at a safe distance, searched the entire facility. They found no one, no signs of forced entry, nothing missing or damaged aside from that one unplugged cable. The officers suggested that the person had probably escaped through another exit into the woods behind the facility. They took it seriously enough to file a report and told me they'd increase patrols in the area. One officer stayed with me while I gathered my things from my office, and then I went home for the night. I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Who would break into a data center just to unplug a cable and then run around scaring the night shift guy? It didn't add up. The next day, my supervisor called me in early. They'd reviewed the security footage from the external cameras. What they found chilled me to my core. After I had entered the administration building from the server farm, a figure appeared on the footage. They hadn't come from inside the building as I'd thought. They'd been outside, hiding somewhere near the entrance. The person, definitely a man based on the build, had stood outside the door to the admin building for 15 minutes, completely motionless, just waiting. Then things got truly disturbing. The man suddenly began pounding on the door violently, not with his fists like a normal person trying to get in, but with his entire body. His arms, his legs, even his head, throwing himself against it in a display of what I can only describe as uncontrolled rage. The footage had no audio, but my supervisor said it looked like he was screaming. This went on for almost a minute before he abruptly stopped, straightened himself, and calmly walked to a side entrance of the building, one that required a key card. Somehow, he got in. That's when I must have heard the door close. The internal cameras didn't show much, just glimpses of a tall figure moving through corridors, seemingly, knowing exactly where the blind spots in our security system were. The last clear image was of him entering the hallway that led to my office. The police never identified the man. They found partial fingerprints that didn't match any in their database. The company took it seriously enough that they authorized me to carry a weapon during my shifts and hired an additional security guard to patrol the grounds at night. I stayed at that job for another 3 months before finding something else. Those were the longest 3 months of my life. Every night, every sound had me on edge. I'd constantly check the security feeds, terrified I'd see that figure standing motionless outside a door again. What still haunts me is the purposefulness of it all. This wasn't some random break-in. He knew about the cable. He knew the building layout and the security camera positions. He waited outside that door for 15 minutes before his bizarre outburst. And then he came directly for me. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't run, if I'd stayed in my office, or worse, if I hadn't heard him in the hallway at all. Would he have just opened my door and What? I still don't know what he wanted. The police suggested he might have been trying to cause a disturbance at the data center or steal information, but that doesn't explain his behavior. Nothing was taken or tampered with beyond that one cable. To this day, when I'm alone at night and hear an unexpected sound, my heart starts racing. I find myself scanning rooms for exits, keeping my back to walls. That night changed something fundamental in me. The data center added more security after I left, and as far as I know, there haven't been any similar incidents. But sometimes when I drive past that long tree-lined road, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there in those woods, waiting for the right moment to return. Story 14. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened to me 15 years ago. It was early September 2008, and I'd been working my butt off at this software company in Seattle for months without a break. I was 28, single, and desperately needed some alone time away from computer screens and office politics. Camping had always been my escape, just me, nature, and blessed silence. Olympic National Park seemed perfect, beautiful, vast, and I knew parts of it well enough to feel comfortable going solo. I'd done plenty of overnight hikes before, so this wasn't my first rodeo. I packed light but smart, my one-person tent, sleeping bag rated for 40 degrees, water filter, camping stove, enough dehydrated meals for 3 days, first aid kit, rain gear, because Washington, map, compass, and my trusty hiking boots that had seen me through dozens of trails. The morning I left, I texted my sister Karen the details, which trailhead I was starting from, which campsite I planned to use near the Hoh River when I expected to be back. Basic safety stuff. I remember feeling so excited driving out there, windows down, some indie rock playlist blasting. The weather forecast showed clear skies, a miracle for Washington in early fall. I parked at the trailhead around 11 in the morning. There were only 2 other cars there, a beat-up Subaru with a bunch of hiking stickers and an older Ford pickup. Nothing that caught my attention particularly. I double-checked my pack, locked the car, and hit the trail. The hike-in was gorgeous. Towering trees, filtering sunlight, that fresh pine smell, birds calling. I remember thinking how this was exactly what I needed. It took me about 4 hours to reach my planned campsite. It was pretty remote, about 6 miles from the trailhead, in a small clearing near the river but off the main trail. I wanted solitude, and I got it. The spot was empty, with a small fire ring someone had made with rocks. I set up my little blue tent, organized my gear, and still had plenty of daylight left, so I explored the area a bit, filtered some water from the river, and then made dinner as the sun started to set. I remember that meal perfectly. One of those backpackers pasta primavera packets that never taste quite right, but hit the spot when you're hungry and tired. I ate sitting on a fallen log, watching the light fade through the trees, feeling completely at peace. I cleaned up carefully, hanging my food bag from a tree branch away from my tent, bears, you know, and got into my sleeping bag around 9:30 as the temperature dropped. That's when things started feeling off. At first it was just normal forest sounds, wind in the trees, occasional rustling that was probably small animals. But around 11, I started hearing what sounded like footsteps, not animal footsteps, human ones, deliberate, circling my campsite. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart suddenly pounding. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe a deer. I tried to go back to sleep but kept my headlamp within reach. The footsteps didn't return, and eventually I drifted off. I jolted awake at what my watch said was 2:17 in the morning. A beam of light was sweeping across the outside of my tent, not the diffuse glow of a distant flashlight, but a direct, purposeful beam, moving slowly from one end of the tent to the other. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. That's when I heard it, a man's voice, calm and conversational, like we were chatting at a coffee shop. "I've been watching you," he said. "You parked your silver Honda Civic at the North Trailhead at 11:03 this morning. Nice bumper sticker." The mountains are calling and I must go. Your backpack is dark green, Osprey brand. You ate pasta for dinner and hung your food bag on that big Douglas fir about 30 yards from your tent. My blood turned to ice. Every detail was correct. I hadn't seen another soul since I'd passed a couple of day hikers hours before reaching my campsite. This person had been tracking me, watching me, and now knew exactly where I was, alone, 6 miles from the nearest road. I scrambled to grab my emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts. The sound was piercing in the quiet forest. "Get away from my tent," I shouted, trying to sound confident. "I've radioed the park rangers and they're on their way." A complete lie. I didn't even have a radio. Then I added, "and I'm armed." Another lie. The light outside my tent switched off immediately. I heard footsteps retreating, twigs snapping. Then silence. I sat frozen in my tent, whistle in one hand, knife in the other. The tiny Swiss Army one I used for cooking, pathetic for defense but better than nothing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them. I didn't dare turn on my headlamp. Minutes passed like hours. Every sound made me flinch, the rustle of leaves, the distant hooting of an owl. Should I run? Stay put? I had no idea where he was. The trail was nearly impossible to follow in the dark, and I could easily get lost. My only hope was that my whistle and threats had scared him off for good. For 2 hours, I sat there, barely breathing, straining to hear any sign of movement. Just as I was starting to think maybe, just maybe, he was gone, I heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. The unmistakable sound of a knife slicing through fabric. A slow, deliberate cut along the back wall of my tent. Pure adrenaline took over. I didn't think, I just moved. I lunged for the tent door, unzipped it in one frantic movement, and burst outside. I caught just a glimpse of a dark figure at the back of my tent before I sprinted into the woods, not even caring which direction I went. My only thought was, get away. I had no light, no trail, nothing but blind panic driving me forward. Branches whipped my face. I tripped on roots and rocks, scraping my hands and knees. Behind me, I heard him crashing through the underbrush, following. I don't know how long I ran, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. I was gasping for breath, my side cramping painfully when my foot caught on something and I went down hard. I rolled behind a fallen tree, pressing myself into the ground, trying desperately to silence my breathing. The footsteps slowed. He was looking for me. I could hear him moving methodically through the forest, back and forth, getting closer, then farther away. After what seemed like forever, the sounds grew more distant. Still, I didn't move. Eventually, I crawled forward and found myself near a massive old-growth tree with a hollowed-out base. I squeezed inside, pulling my knees to my chest. The space was tight but completely hidden from view. I stayed there, shivering from cold and fear, until the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees. Morning came with an eerie silence. No birds singing, no sounds of pursuit. I waited until full daylight before creeping out of my hiding place. I was completely disoriented, with no idea which direction my campsite lay. My feet were blistered from running in just socks. I realized I'd left my boots in the tent. My thin thermal pajamas were torn and dirty. I had nothing, no water, no food, no map. After getting my bearings from the rising sun, I decided not to risk returning to my campsite. Instead, I headed downhill, hoping to intersect with the main trail. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like a man with a knife. It took me nearly 3 hours of painful hiking to finally stumble onto the main trail. When I saw a group of 4 hikers coming toward me, 2 couples in their 50s with walking poles and friendly faces, I burst into tears. They gave me water and a granola bar while I choked out what had happened. One of them had a satellite phone and called the ranger station, while another gave me her spare pair of socks and a light jacket. We hiked together to the ranger station where I gave a full report. The rangers immediately sent a team to my campsite. They found my tent slashed open, my belongings scattered. Some things were missing. my driver's license from my wallet, a small photo of me and my sister that I'd kept in my backpack, and weirdly, the hair elastic I'd left by my sleeping bag. The investigation didn't find much. No fingerprints, no clear footprints, nothing that could identify who had stalked me. The rangers speculated it might have been someone who saw me on the trail and followed me to my isolated campsite. They documented everything and filed a report, but warned me that cases like this in vast wilderness areas rarely get solved. I thought that was the end of it, a terrifying experience that would eventually become just a bad memory. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, a small padded envelope arrived at my apartment in Seattle. No return address. Inside was my driver's license, the one that had been in my wallet at the campsite. Nothing else, no note, nothing. Just my license with my home address clearly printed on it. I called the police immediately. They took the envelope for fingerprinting but found nothing useful. They advised me to change my locks, get a security system, consider moving. I did all three within a week. The knowledge that this person, whoever he was, knew where I lived nearly destroyed me. I couldn't sleep. I jumped at every sound. I took a leave of absence from work, started seeing a therapist specialized in trauma. For months, I stayed with my sister or friends, afraid to be alone in my new apartment despite the heavy-duty locks and alarm system. No other packages came. No one suspicious ever approached me. But the damage was done. That night changed everything about how I move through the world. I still love the outdoors, but I've never camped alone again. I've become almost obsessive about personal security. In the years since, I've channeled my experience into something constructive. I started leading wilderness safety workshops for women hikers. I talk openly about what happened to me and what I wish I'd done differently. Camping closer to other people, carrying a satellite communicator, having a real defense plan instead of false bravado. The case remains open but inactive in some National Park Service file. Sometimes I wonder if my stalker did this to other women, or if I was just randomly targeted. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that the boundary between civilization and wilderness isn't what frightens me anymore. It's the predators who move between those worlds, watching and waiting for someone vulnerable. 15 years later, I still check my locks twice before bed. I still scan parking lots for unfamiliar vehicles. And sometimes when I'm hiking with friends and hear a twig snap in the forest, I freeze, just for a second, and remember the sound of a knife slicing through tent fabric in the dead of night. Story 15. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night 6 years ago. I was 19, studying at the Naval School in southern Porto Alegre. The military training was brutal, physically and mentally draining, but I'd made two good friends who made it all bearable, Pedro and Tiago. That particular Tuesday had been absolute hell. We'd spent weeks preparing for this navigation test that would determine whether we'd advance to the next phase of training. I'd studied my ass off, but the moment I sat down, my mind went completely blank. Pedro and Tiago didn't fare any better. We all failed spectacularly. After getting our results that afternoon, the three of us were devastated. Tiago suggested we go get ice cream to cheer ourselves up. It sounds childish, but when you're under that kind of pressure, sometimes you just need something simple to make you feel human again. Plus, Tiago had just gotten his dad's car for the week, a beat-up old Fiat that had seen better days, but it was freedom on wheels, as far as we were concerned. "Let's go to that place by the lake," Tiago said. "They have the best Sundays." It was already getting dark, around 7 in the evening, but none of us wanted to go back to the dorms and face the other guys who'd passed the test. So we piled into Tiago's car, him driving, me in the passenger seat, and Pedro in the back. The ice cream place was about 40 minutes away, but Tiago took a shortcut he swore would get us there in 25. I should have known better. Tiago's shortcuts always ended up taking twice as long. Before we knew it, we were driving through areas I'd never seen before. The city lights faded behind us, replaced by dense forest on both sides of the road. "Dude, where are we?" I asked after we'd been driving for almost an hour. The road had narrowed to a two-lane strip of asphalt with no streetlights. Our headlights cut through the darkness, but beyond their reach was absolute blackness. "Just a bit further," Tiago said, but I could tell by his voice that he was clueless. Pedro leaned forward from the back seat. "Man, we're lost. Just admit it." "We're not lost," Tiago insisted. "I just took a wrong turn back there. We'll find another way." The road seemed to stretch endlessly. We hadn't passed another car in at least 20 minutes. My phone showed no service bars. Pedro's and Tiago's were the same. "This is ridiculous," I said. "We should turn around." "Wait," Tiago suddenly said, slowing the car. "I need to pee, like really bad." "Now? Are you serious?" Pedro groaned. "There's nothing out here. I can't hold it anymore. All that coffee from studying," Tiago said, looking around desperately. That's when we saw it. A small dirt road branching off to the right, barely visible in the darkness. If Tiago hadn't slowed down, we would have missed it entirely. "I'll just pull in there real quick," Tiago said, already turning the wheel. "Dude, no," I protested. "That's how horror movies start." "It'll take 2 minutes," Tiago insisted. "I'm about to burst here." The moment we turned onto that dirt road, something felt wrong. The car's headlights illuminated a narrow path flanked by tall trees whose branches seemed to reach toward us like fingers. The dirt was reddish, almost like clay, and the car bumped and jolted as we drove deeper. "This is far enough," Pedro said after we'd gone about 50 meters in. "Just go behind a tree, man." Tiago didn't respond. He kept driving. "Tiago, stop the car," I said more forcefully this time. He still didn't answer, just kept pressing forward. I was about to grab the wheel when the trees suddenly cleared, and we found ourselves at the edge of a large clearing. In the center of the clearing was a massive bonfire. The flames reached at least 15 feet high, casting an orange glow that illuminated the entire area. Around the fire were figures. I couldn't immediately tell how many, maybe 20 or 30, standing completely still. Tiago finally stopped the car. "What the hell is this?" Pedro whispered from the back. None of us moved. None of us spoke. We just stared. The figures around the fire were wearing what looked like dark robes or long coats. They were arranged in a perfect circle around the flames, facing inward. They hadn't seemed to notice our arrival, or if they had, they gave no indication. "Turn around," I whispered to Tiago. "Now." Tiago's hands were frozen on the steering wheel. His knuckles had gone white from gripping it so hard. "Tiago," I hissed, not daring to raise my voice. "Turn. The car. Around." That's when one of the figures by the fire turned toward us, then another, and another, until half of them were facing our direction. My blood ran cold. I couldn't make out their features clearly from this distance, but something about their movements was unnatural, too fluid, too synchronized. "They're coming." Pedro's voice cracked behind me. He was right. The figures that had turned toward us were now moving in our direction, not running, not even walking quickly, just a steady, deliberate pace. But it wasn't just those from the circle around the fire. From the tree line on either side of the clearing, more figures emerged. They were coming from all directions, moving toward our car with that same measured pace. "Tiago," I shouted, no longer caring about being quiet. "Start the car. Go." Tiago didn't move. His eyes were wide, fixed on the approaching figures. He was breathing in short, rapid gasps. I looked back at the nearest figure. It was maybe 30 feet away now, and I still couldn't see a face within the hood of its robe. Just darkness. "Tiago!" Pedro screamed. When Tiago still didn't respond, I reached over and grabbed the gear shift, jamming it into reverse. The car jerked but didn't move. "The brake," I said, reaching down with my left foot to press Tiago's right foot harder on the brake pedal. "Let go of the brake." Finally, Tiago seemed to snap out of it. He lifted his foot, and I pressed the gas pedal with my left foot, awkwardly stretched across. The car lurched backward. "Pedro," I called to the back seat, "can you see behind us?" Pedro had already pulled out his flashlight. He always carried one, part of his Boy Scout upbringing that we used to tease him about. He directed the beam out the rear window. "There's a gap." he said, his voice shaking. Between the ones coming from the left and right. Go straight back. Tiago had regained enough control to take over, his foot replacing mine on the gas pedal. We reversed slowly, the car bouncing over the uneven ground. The figures were getting closer on both sides. I could see more details now. Their robes weren't black as I'd initially thought, but a deep crimson color that looked almost black in the darkness. They moved with an unsettling grace, as if floating just above the ground. Faster, I urged Tiago, who was still reversing too slowly. I can't see, he said, his voice barely audible. Pedro, keep the light steady, I said. That's when Pedro whispered something I couldn't hear. What? I asked, not taking my eyes off the approaching figures. They don't have faces, Pedro repeated, louder this time. None of them have faces. I turned to look at him. His face was drained of color, the flashlight trembling in his hand. What do you mean? I asked. Look, he said, pointing the flashlight at the nearest figure, now just meters from the car. I looked. The hood cast shadows, but not enough to completely obscure what should have been a face. Instead, there was just smoothness, like skin stretched over an egg, with no features whatsoever. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank oval. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It refused to accept it. One of the figures reached out toward the car. Its hand was pale, with fingers that seemed too long, too thin. Go! I screamed. Tiago finally floored it. The tires spun in the dirt before finding purchase, and we shot backward. The figure's hand grazed the hood as we reversed. We careened backward down the dirt path, branches scraping against the sides of the car. Pedro kept his flashlight pointed behind us, guiding Tiago through the darkness. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of pursuit. Don't stop until we hit the main road, I said. Nobody argued. When we finally reached the asphalt, Tiago spun the car around so fast I thought we might flip. Then we were speeding away, the engine of the old Fiat protesting as Tiago pushed it to its limits. None of us spoke. The only sound was our breathing and the strain of the engine. I kept checking the side mirrors, expecting to see those figures somehow keeping pace with us. But there was nothing behind us except darkness. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 45 minutes. Eventually, we saw lights ahead. We were approaching the outskirts of Porto Alegre again. Only then did Tiago slow down. What? He started, then stopped. His voice was hoarse. What was that? Neither Pedro nor I answered. What could we say? None of us had an explanation for what we'd seen. When we finally reached the naval school, it was past midnight. We sat in the parking lot for a long time, the engine off, just breathing. We don't talk about this, Pedro finally said. Not to anyone? Tiago and I nodded. We got out of the car and walked back to our dorms without another word. We never discussed it again. Not the next day, not the next week, not ever. We remained friends, but there was always this unspoken thing between us. Sometimes I'd catch Pedro's eye across the mess hall, or Tiago would hesitate before getting into a car at night, and I knew they were thinking about it too. We all graduated from naval school. Tiago now works on a cargo ship in the Atlantic. Pedro is stationed at a naval base in Rio. I stayed in Porto Alegre. We've drifted apart, the way people do. But sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about that clearing in the woods, about the bonfire and the figures surrounding it, about their blank, featureless faces, and I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't managed to get away, if Tiago hadn't snapped out of his trance, if Pedro hadn't spotted the gap behind us. I've tried researching local cults, strange rituals, anything that might explain what we saw. I've never found anything conclusive. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just some weird prank, or that the stress of failing the test made us hallucinate the whole thing. But then I remember the sound of those elongated fingers scraping across the hood of the car, the perfect, eerie synchronization of their movements, the emptiness where their faces should have been. And I know, deep down, that whatever we encountered that night wasn't human, it wasn't natural, it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in our world, but somehow does. Hidden away on lonely dirt roads, where people aren't supposed to go. I still drive through Porto Alegre sometimes, on roads surrounded by forest, and every time I pass a dirt road branching off into the trees, I feel a chill run down my spine. Because I know what might be waiting there, around a bonfire in a clearing, watching with faces that aren't faces at all, waiting for someone else who took a wrong turn. Story 16. I don't even like typing this out, but I need to share what happened to me. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar or can explain what I saw. I've been lurking on this forum for months, reading everyone's experiences, but I never thought I'd be posting my own story. This happened about 7 months ago during one of the worst autumn storms we've had in years. I still live in my childhood home, a massive colonial house that's been standing for over 150 years. It's in a small town called Millfield, where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. The town is pretty isolated, surrounded by dense forests and hills, about 40 minutes from the nearest proper city. After my dad passed away 5 years ago, it's just been me and my mom living here. My 2 sisters moved away years ago, one to California and the other to Chicago. Neither of them wanted anything to do with this place. I don't blame them. It's always had a weird vibe, but it's home. My bedroom is on the 3rd floor, which was originally an attic that my parents converted when all of us kids were still living here. It's spacious, but has these slanted ceilings and a dormer window that looks out onto the street. Being up so high, I can hear everything in this house. The pipes groaning, the foundation settling, the wind finding every crack and crevice. The acoustics are bizarre. Sometimes I can hear my mom whispering on the phone in the kitchen 2 floors down, but other times a truck could drive by and I wouldn't notice. That night, I remember the weather forecast had warned about severe thunderstorms, but nobody expected how bad it would get. The rain started around 7 in the evening, just a light drizzle at first. By 10, it was coming down in sheets, hammering against the roof and windows like someone was throwing buckets of water at the house. The wind was worse, howling and shrieking, making the whole structure creak and moan. Tree branches were scraping against the siding, and twice I heard what sounded like something heavy falling in the yard. I fell asleep eventually, despite the noise, around midnight. I remember checking my phone before closing my eyes. The power had been flickering, but thankfully it stayed on. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I know because I checked my phone, I woke up suddenly. Something felt different. The storm was still raging outside, but I heard something else cutting through the chaos. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, like someone wearing work boots, striking the pavement outside with deliberate slowness. They had this weird rhythm to them, not quite normal walking. It was more like step, drag, step, drag. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor checking for storm damage, but who would be out in that weather at 3 in the morning? The footsteps got closer to our house, and then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Whistling. Not cheerful whistling, not even a recognizable tune. It was discordant, atonal, like someone was just pushing air through their teeth without caring about the melody. But somehow it was loud enough to cut through the howling wind and pounding rain. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The whistling got louder, more insistent. The footsteps stopped moving. They were right outside our house now. I don't know why I didn't just pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was that weird compulsion you get sometimes to look at things that scare you. I slid out of bed, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and crept toward my window. The streetlight outside our house was flickering, casting these weird strobe-like pulses of orange light across the flooding street. And there, standing directly in the middle of the road, was a figure. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This wasn't a normal person. Whoever, whatever, it was stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and it wore this long, dark coat that seemed to merge with the darkness around it. The coat moved strangely, almost like it was floating on water, even though the wind was blowing in the opposite direction. The rain was coming down in torrents, but this figure didn't seem affected by it at all. It just stood there, perfectly still, facing our house. I couldn't make out any features, just this tall, dark silhouette with that coat rippling around it like something alive. As I stood there, frozen at my window, the worst thing happened. The figure slowly tilted its head back, looking up, directly at my window, directly at me. I know it couldn't possibly see me through the darkness and the rain-streaked glass, but I felt its gaze lock onto mine like a physical weight. The whistling got louder, so much louder. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It felt like it was right in my ear, inside my head. My ears started ringing painfully, and I felt this pressure building behind my eyes. I wanted to move away from the window, to call for my mom, to do anything, but I was completely paralyzed, not out of some supernatural force, just pure, primal fear. I couldn't even blink. The figure started to move. It took one step toward our house, then another. Its movements were wrong somehow, too fluid, like it wasn't actually walking but gliding with the illusion of steps. It reached the edge of our front yard and stopped at the sidewalk. It stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, just waiting, staring up at me, whistling that horrible non-melody that made my teeth hurt and my stomach churn. Then it raised one unnaturally long arm. I thought it was pointing at me, but instead, it slowly put what I assume was a finger to where its lips would be, a universal shh gesture. The whistling stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. The storm seemed to dim around this figure, like it was absorbing the sound and the fury. After what felt like forever, it lowered its arm and did something even more terrifying. It nodded at me. A slow, deliberate nod, like we had just made some kind of agreement. Then it turned and walked away, back the way it had come. As it moved down the street, the whistling started again, softer now, fading with distance. I watched until it disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlights. I stood at that window for another hour, afraid to move, afraid it would come back if I stopped watching. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I collapsed back into bed, pulling all my blankets around me like a shield. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to sunlight streaming through my window. The storm had passed, leaving behind broken branches, scattered leaves, and puddles everywhere. It looked like any normal aftermath of a bad storm. I went downstairs to find my mom already making coffee. "That was some storm last night," she said casually. "Did you sleep through it?" I almost told her what I'd seen, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of sounding crazy, or maybe it was the memory of that shh gesture. Instead, I just mumbled something about waking up a few times. We went outside later to check for damage. There were branches down everywhere, and our neighbor's fence had partially collapsed. As I helped clean up, I kept looking down the street, half expecting to see abnormally large footprints or some other evidence. There was nothing. But when we got to our sidewalk, the exact spot where the figure had stopped, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single perfect circle burned into the concrete, about the size of a quarter. It looked like someone had pressed a red-hot metal rod against the sidewalk. The burn mark went deep, at least half an inch into the concrete. Mom didn't notice it, and I didn't point it out. I covered it with some fallen leaves and tried to forget about it. But I couldn't forget. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up at exactly 3:17 a.m., ears straining for the sound of heavy footsteps or that awful whistling. I started sleeping with my curtains closed and my bedroom door locked, even though I knew that wouldn't stop whatever I'd seen. The worst part was the dreams. In them, I'm standing outside in that same storm, and the tall figure is leading me somewhere. always whistling that discordant tune. I never see where we're going because I always wake up just as we reach some kind of threshold, a door or a cave, or sometimes just a shadow that's darker than the rest of the darkness. I've researched local folklore, trying to find any mention of a tall stranger or significant whistling in our town's history. I found nothing concrete, but there are stories from the early settlers about the night walker who would appear during storms and take people who ventured outside. They were probably just cautionary tales to keep people indoors during bad weather, but they hit too close to home. The burn mark on the sidewalk is still there. I've scrubbed it, tried to chip it away, even poured concrete patch over it. Nothing works. The patch crumbled away overnight and the mark remains, perfectly circular and impossibly deep. 7 months have passed and I haven't seen the figure again, but every time it rains heavily, I find myself standing at that window, scanning the street below. Sometimes I think I hear whistling in the distance, but it could just be the wind. I don't know what visited our house that night. I don't know why it seemed to single me out or what would have happened if I had gone outside. All I know is that it was never human, and I'm convinced it's still out there, walking in the rain, whistling its terrible tune, waiting for me to follow. The strangest thing. Last week I found myself unconsciously whistling while doing the dishes. My mom asked what song it was, and I realized with horror that I was whistling that same discordant melody. I stopped immediately, but sometimes I catch myself doing it again, especially when I'm not thinking about it. I still haven't told anyone else about this. How could I? But I needed to write it down, to share it with people who might understand or have experienced something similar. Because the worst fear isn't seeing something inexplicable, it's the gnawing suspicion that whatever you saw isn't finished with you yet. Story 17. I still have trouble sleeping when it rains hard. It's been almost 7 months since that night in April, but every time I hear thunder, I find myself checking the locks on my windows and doors multiple times. I know it probably sounds paranoid, but if you'd been through what I experienced, you'd understand. It was a Tuesday evening, around 8 o'clock. I remember because I'd stayed late at work trying to finish a project before the deadline, and I was already in a crappy mood when the storm hit. April storms in our area can be brutal, and this one was particularly nasty. Thunder that shook the windows, lightning every few seconds, and rain coming down in sheets so thick I could barely see the road during my drive home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was soaked just from the short run from my car to the front door. As soon as I got inside, I realized something was off. The house was pitch black. I tried the light switch, but nothing happened. Great, a power outage on top of everything else. I used the flashlight on my phone to navigate to the kitchen where I keep emergency candles. I checked outside and saw that the entire neighborhood was dark. Not a single porch light or window glowing anywhere on my street. The storm must have knocked out a transformer or something. I texted my neighbor Mark to see if he knew anything about when power might be restored, but he just replied that the electric company's website was saying, assessing the situation, with no estimated time for repairs. Typical. Since I couldn't cook dinner without electricity, I grabbed some chips and a soda from the pantry and settled into my living room. My laptop had about 6 hours of battery life, and my phone was at 80%, so I figured I'd just watch some YouTube videos until either the power came back or I got tired enough to go to bed. The storm was getting worse outside. Rain pounded against the windows and roof so loudly that I had to turn the volume on my laptop all the way up just to hear my videos. Around 10 o'clock, I paused what I was watching to use the bathroom. When I came back, I heard something odd over the storm, a tapping sound coming from my front window. At first, I thought it was just a branch or something being blown against the glass. We have a few trees in the yard, and it wouldn't be unusual for debris to hit the house during weather like this. But as I got closer to the window, I realized the tapping had a pattern to it. 3 taps, pause, 3 more taps. I moved the blinds just enough to peek out, and my blood ran cold. There was a man standing on my front lawn, staring directly at my window. Even in the darkness, I could see his hair was plastered to his head from the rain, and water was streaming down his face. He was wearing what looked like a dark jacket, completely soaked through. When he saw me looking out, he started shouting something, but I couldn't hear him over the storm. He gestured frantically, pointing at my house and then down the street. I couldn't make out his facial features clearly in the darkness, but something about him seemed off. Maybe it was just the situation. Who stands in a yard during a severe thunderstorm? I quickly closed the blinds and stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. The tapping started again, more insistent this time. I wasn't about to open my door to a stranger in the middle of a power outage, especially one who was acting so strangely. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There's a wet guy in my yard? They'd probably laugh it off. After about a minute, the tapping stopped. I peeked out again and saw that the man was gone. I figured he must have been a neighbor I didn't recognize, maybe trying to tell me something about the power outage or asking to use my phone. Still, something didn't feel right about the encounter. I tried to get back to my videos, but I was too on edge to focus. Every noise made me jump. I kept the volume lower so I could hear if anything was happening outside, but that just made it worse because then I could hear all the creaks and groans of the house responding to the wind and rain. Around 11, I must have dozed off on the couch despite my nerves. My laptop was still open on the coffee table, its screen the only light in the room. I'm not sure how long I was asleep before I was jolted awake by a tremendous crash from the back of the house. At first, I thought a tree branch had fallen on the roof. I sat up, disoriented, and listened. The storm was still raging outside, but there was a new sound now, a rhythmic pattering that didn't match the rain on the roof. It took my sleep-addled brain a few seconds to realize what I was hearing. Rain coming in through an opening in my house. I grabbed my phone and turned. On the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I slowly made my way toward the sound, which was coming from my kitchen at the back of the house. As I approached, I felt a cold draft, and the sound of the rain got louder. When I turned the corner into the kitchen, I saw it. The window above my sink was completely shattered. Glass was everywhere, and rain was pouring in, soaking my countertops and floor. The curtains were whipping around in the wind. I stood there frozen, trying to process what I was seeing when movement caught my eye. Just a glimpse, the shoulder of someone moving behind the wall that separates my kitchen from the hallway to the bedrooms. Someone was in my house. I didn't think, I didn't call out. Some survival instinct kicked in, and I just turned and ran. I didn't even grab my keys, just bolted straight out the front door into the pouring rain. I sprinted across my lawn and up to Mark's house next door, pounding on his door like a madman. Mark opened the door looking confused and half asleep, but as soon as he saw my face, he pulled me inside and locked the door behind me. I was hyperventilating, trying to explain what happened between gasps. He sat me down, handed me a towel, and called the police while I tried to calm down enough to speak coherently. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, an eternity when you know there's an intruder potentially still in your home. 2 officers went to check my house while a third stayed with Mark and me to take my statement. I described everything. The man at the window earlier, the broken glass, the glimpse of someone inside. The officer asked if anything like this had happened before, if I had any enemies, if I'd had any strange interactions lately. All no. After what felt like forever, the other officers returned. They'd searched my entire house and found no one, but confirmed that the back window had been completely shattered, not by a branch or debris, but deliberately. Broken with what they thought was a rock they found on the kitchen floor. They'd also found wet footprints throughout my house, confirming that someone had definitely been inside. One of the officers told me that I wasn't the only one who'd had a strange experience that night. There had been 2 other attempted break-ins in the neighborhood and several reports of a suspicious person going door to door. I was the only one whose home had actually been invaded, though. They asked me to come back to my house to check if anything was missing, but as far as I could tell, nothing had been taken. My laptop was still on the coffee table, my wallet and keys were where I'd left them, and even the expensive watch my dad had given me was still in my bedroom. The police helped me board up the broken window temporarily and took fingerprints, but they weren't optimistic about finding the guy. With the storm and power outage, none of the neighborhood security cameras had been working. The description I gave, a man with wet dark hair in a dark jacket, wasn't exactly distinctive. I ended up staying at Mark's that night. I couldn't bear the thought of being in my house, hearing every creak and wondering if the intruder would return. The next morning, the power was back on, and in the daylight, everything seemed less terrifying. But the broken window and the muddy footprints throughout my home were very real reminders that it hadn't been a nightmare. Over the next few days, I installed a security system, replaced all my locks, and added motion sensor lights around the property. The police increased patrols in our area for a while, but they never caught the guy. No one matching his description was seen in the neighborhood again. What keeps me up at night isn't just the break-in itself, but the questions I can't answer. Why was he standing in my yard earlier? What was he trying to tell me? Was he warning me about something? Or was it all part of some plan to get me to open my door? And, most disturbing of all, what was he doing in my house? If he wasn't there to steal anything, what did he want? Sometimes I think about moving, starting fresh somewhere else, but then I wonder if that would even help. Would I just take the fear with me? Would I jump at every thunderstorm, check behind every door? It's been 7 months, and I still don't have any answers. Just the memory of that shoulder disappearing around the corner in my dark house, and the knowledge that for reasons I'll probably never understand, on that stormy night in April, someone chose my home and chose me. Story 18. I've been struggling with whether to share this for almost a decade now. What happened to me and my fellow grad students on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, in 2013 has haunted me every day since. I'm only writing this because I saw another post about unexplained group disappearances, and I need someone, anyone, to tell me I'm not losing my mind. I was one of 10 anthropology grad students from Westlake University selected for what was supposed to be this amazing cultural exchange program with Rapa Nui. 6 weeks of immersive field work, living with local families, documenting traditional practices. For an anthropology student, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. The first 2 weeks were everything I'd hoped for. My host family was incredibly welcoming. They lived in a modest home near Hangaroa, the main town. I spent my days interviewing elders about their customs, photographing sites, and attending community events. The island was breathtaking, those massive stone moai statues against the backdrop of the ocean, the rolling green hills, the caves and volcanic craters. At night, I'd write in my journal for hours, documenting everything. My closest friends in the program were Maya Chen, Derek Watson, Alicia Navarro, and Layla Kapoor. We'd meet up whenever we could to compare notes and explore the island together. Everything was normal until Easter Sunday. I woke up around 3 in the morning to this strange chanting sound coming from somewhere outside my window. It wasn't particularly loud, but something about it sent chills down my spine. The rhythm was unlike anything I'd heard before, not quite singing, not quite speaking. I remember sitting up in bed, straining to hear it better, and feeling this overwhelming urge to go outside and find its source. But then my host mother knocked on my door, asking if I was okay. When I mentioned the chanting, she looked concerned, isn't the right word. Afraid is more like it. She insisted I stay in my room until morning and closed my door firmly. The next day at our scheduled dinner, Maya, Derek, and Alicia didn't show up. At first, we thought maybe they'd lost track of time or decided to explore somewhere together, but when we called their host families, no one had seen them since the previous night. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, our faculty advisor, immediately contacted local authorities, and search parties were organized. I remember feeling this creeping dread as I told Dr. Blackwood about the chanting I'd heard. Another student, Jamal, mentioned he'd heard it too. Then Layla admitted she'd also woken up to the same sound. The 3 of us were staying with different families scattered across the island. There was no way we could have heard the same thing unless it had been happening everywhere. On the second day of searching, a fisherman found Maya's backpack on this isolated beach on the far side of the island. The police let me look through it since I was her friend. Her journal was inside, and the last entry still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. She wrote about waking up to strange chanting and planning to meet with Derek and Alicia to discuss similar experiences they'd been having. But there was something else. She mentioned feeling like she was being watched by eyes that weren't there and having dreams about walking among the ancestors. By the fourth day, we were all terrified. The search parties expanded, and that's when they found the campsite in a cave near Rano Raraku crater. I wasn't part of the group that discovered it, but the police showed us photos, hoping we might recognize something that would help find our friends. 3 sleeping bags were arranged around this crude altar with wooden figures on it. The figures were covered in what tests later confirmed was human blood. Under each figure was one of their smartphones, screens shattered in identical patterns, like someone had pressed their thumb into the center of each screen with enough force to break it, creating this starburst pattern of cracks. That same evening, Dr. Blackwood received an email from Derek's university account. I was in her office when she opened it. The message just said, "The exchange has already happened. We're still here, just not as we were." The timestamp showed 3 in the morning, exactly when the chanting had been reported. The IT department later confirmed the email came from Derek's phone, which was supposedly at the campsite, screen shattered, battery dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, not the chanting, but whispers just outside my comprehension. I started noticing Layla and Jamal were acting differently too. During the day, they'd stare at the ocean for hours. I caught Layla speaking to one of the locals in what sounded like fluent Rapa Nui, a language none of us had studied beyond a few basic phrases. When I asked her about it later, she claimed not to remember the conversation. 1 week after the first disappearances, Layla and Jamal vanished too. Their host families said they'd been behaving strangely for days, sometimes speaking in Rapa Nui, spending hours staring at nothing, drawing weird symbols in the dirt. They'd both mentioned hearing the ancestors calling them. I was terrified I'd be next. I begged Dr. Blackwood to let me stay with her instead of my host family, and she agreed. That night, the police found 5 handcrafted dolls hidden in a storage room at the community center where we often gathered. Each doll resembled one of the missing students with disturbing accuracy, down to the clothes they'd been wearing when they disappeared. Each had scraps of their actual clothing and human hair that DNA tests later matched to them. The investigation took a turn when we discovered all 5 missing students had visited Ahua Kivi, a ceremonial site with 7 Moai statues facing the ocean. One of the older local researchers reluctantly told us this site was traditionally used for Tevai Kava, the exchange of spirits. It was a ritual performed when the moon was in a specific phase, which had occurred precisely on Easter Sunday. When investigators searched Ahua Kivi, they found a freshly excavated chamber beneath one of the platforms. Inside were 5 stone containers arranged in a pattern that matched specific stars visible during Easter week. Each container held water and something personal belonging to each missing student: Maya's bracelet, Derek's watch, Alicia's earring, Layla's ring, and Jamal's pendant. I started having nightmares where I'd see my friends standing among the Moai, their eyes completely black, speaking in voices that weren't their own. In my dreams, they'd tell me they were learning from the ancestors and that they would return changed. I'd wake up sweating, convinced someone was standing in the corner of my room. The remaining students, including myself, were preparing to leave the island when the news came. 40 days after they first disappeared, a naval vessel had rescued all 5 students swimming nearly 2 miles offshore. They were alive, but disoriented, with identical scarification markings on their palms, intricate patterns that one of the elders identified as ancient symbols representing the pathway between worlds. I was there when they were brought to the hospital. They recognized me, knew my name, but there was something off about them. They spoke of walking among the ancestors and seeing through stone eyes. They insisted they'd only been gone for a few days, not weeks. When their families arrived, they showed no emotional connection despite recognizing them. Most disturbing was their knowledge of Rapa Nui language, customs, and oral histories, things they couldn't possibly have learned in the short time they'd been on the island. Maya could recite entire genealogies of ancient chiefs. Derek described ceremonial practices that even some of the local elders only vaguely remembered. They knew details about traditional practices that were supposedly known only to those initiated into certain rituals. The investigation officially concluded that they had experienced some kind of group psychosis, possibly triggered by something they consumed or extreme stress. But that doesn't explain how they survived 40 days without food or water, or how they ended up miles offshore, or the identical markings on their palms, or their inexplicable knowledge. 3 of them, Derek, Alicia, and Jamal, eventually returned to academic work, though in completely different fields. Maya moved permanently to Rapa Nui in 2015. I've tried contacting her a few times, but her responses are always brief and strange, like she's speaking in code. No one knows where Layla is. She disappeared again 6 months after returning home. The exchange program was permanently discontinued. Most of us don't talk about what happened. It's like this unspoken agreement to pretend it was just some weird misunderstanding. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Sometimes I still wake up at exactly 3 in the morning, hearing that chanting in the distance. Sometimes I look in the mirror, and for just a split second, I don't recognize the person looking back at me. And sometimes I find myself writing or speaking words in Rapa Nui, a language I never learned. I don't know what happened. To my friends on that island, I don't know what exchange took place, but I know something crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever came back with them didn't stay with just them.